Hello, where you at, man? We're looking for you. Where's the co-host?
Who you're looking for, but it's not who you think it is.
It's only like the 200th episode of the show, the dang podcast. Where the hell are you? It's Saturday night, brother.
Saturday night, brother. I thought that shit started at 8 o'clock.
No, it doesn't start at 8 o'clock. I told you last night, 5. Asshole.
And then it was eerily quiet. And then my mind was kind of like, the head in the fishbowl.
Then it takes me into the bathroom and says, this is how you brush your teeth. Brush, rinse, repeat. Brush, rinse, repeat. Brush, rinse, repeat.
But there were 2 girls, and it was like, you'll have to give us a ride. You can't fill us no. You can't refuse us. He'll let us in his car.
The thoughts were all alone in this empty void. The head in the fishbowl.
This doesn't look right. They got close enough where he said he could see, their eyes and how intelligent they seem. This doesn't look right. These gremlin type creatures. This doesn't look right. No pupils, no iris. 3 fingers, 3 long fingers. And this is when the mental torture.
And then it was eerily quiet.
Welcome to the 200th episode.
We made it.
We did.
They did.
We made it. We have a studio audience of 2 people. Well, actually, technically 3.
We'd like to thank our fan.
Both of you.
And how's it going, Rob?
Oh, man, it's great.
We've been setting up all day for this.
Yep. Cleaning, prepping,
stressing out.
Stressing,
and,
dealing with plumbing issues.
oh,
The
yeah.
usual. What? You don't?
You cleaned?
Yeah, we cleaned for you, man.
You should have seen it yesterday.
And guess what?
Yes.
Luke isn't here.
Oh, well, imagine that.
I know. It's only the 200th episode.
It's
and
not
all
a big
that,
deal.
you know?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Jeez. We actually have as studio guests.
Plural.
I know. And we're waiting on a 3rd. But right next to me is Joshua Cutchin.
Hi. Hi, guys. And ladies.
Yeah. And lady.
Lady. Yeah. All the lady in the house say yeah.
I feel really like I'm in a corner right now.
Yeah, I didn't mean to box you in.
I'm just...
I have one of those bodies that just tends to box people in, I guess.
So how you been, man? How was the trip? How was the trip up here to good old Nashville?
Good. It beat driving up 85, which is what I do most of the time. But it was nice. I'm surprised that I didn't have to stop halfway through and wipe down my back windshield because I had my brains exploded out the back of my head by my co-pilot. Some of our conversations, some really interesting, cool, heady stuff. It was a lot better than making the drive on my own. That's for sure. So,
Who was your co-pilot?
Yeah.
Randall Carlson is my co-pilot.
Otherwise known as God, right?
And aspiring God, as we all are.
Sure.
Right?
Yes.
I hope I'm not alone in this. We're all aspiring to the Godhead, right? Okay.
Randall, very cool to have you with us in the studio. It's a real privilege,
thanks,
man.
Adam. Yeah, it feels good to be here, except I don't know, I'm kind of nervous about this couch. It's kind of like feeling like might be something from Nightmare on the Elm Street, and it's going to swallow me.
Yeah,
up in
it's got a few blood stains
like I'm going
on
to just
it.
disappear in a moment. You're just going to see my feet sticking out. And
That's Luke's bed, I think.
That one's Luke's bed.
Yeah, that's Luke's
nice.
bed. Yeah. This is the one that Rob likes to pass out on at the end of the night.
That's my
You will
bed.
see him here later on at about 11:30 to 12 o'clock in the evening.
I mean, it's comfortable, but not conducive to aware podcasting. Like, I find my posture getting worse and worse. I'm either turning into a Pokeball or like a fetus, one or the other, just slightly crouching.
And we have someone else over here. We got another guest coming that's on the way. But, Joe, why don't you pull your mic over to you so people can actually hear you. Hi, Joe.
Hello.
Joe was like one of our first guests on Paranormal back on episode 3. and he's been with us for a while. He's gone on a couple of road trips. Went to Minneapolis, where we actually met Randall at the Paranormal Symposium.
Yeah, everybody listen to Randall. He's not joking.
Very true. And Joe, you've got another contraption over here.
Yeah, I set up the voice, the Ghost Pro stuff, but we just lost power, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Just lost power?
Yeah, it was strange.
Well, it's a ghost, man.
Well, it lasted an hour, and it was listening to you guys, but that's about it.
Did it say anything cool before it died?
It was just talking about horses.
Huh.
Horses?
Yeah. Rob's got a story about that.
Well,
do you have a story about horses?
I had a strange conversation with our friend Jeff Heim about horses this week.
Did you really?
Yeah, when he shows up, you can ask him about it.
Is he going to show up?
I heard a rumor he was.
Oh. I thought he had construction workers. I thought Jeff's too good for us.
He had to run to Home Depot or something. You know how it is.
He always has to run to Home Depot.
Yeah.
You're right. Let's still run to Home Depot.
Home Depot and Chick-fil-A call. He just got that call.
Yeah, exactly. And over here in Hermitage, Home Depot is right next to Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
So, and Will Surfiel, you might as well introduce yourself too.
Hello, people. My name is Surfiel Stevenson. I'm a avid supporter of Paranormal podcast, and they've been so gracious as to invite me to partake in this tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to have a question and answer session for the guests afterwards, and you have some questions that you came up with.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been reading and listening to podcasts of both of their work and Dr. Future as well for the past few days, trying to come up with some good questions.
Nice. Sweet. And we have the audience here, which now is 2 people. And we do have a mic over there that if people want to ask questions, you can ask these distinguished guests over here.
No hardball questions, though. Just
Like, what was the last thing you ate?
No math questions.
No math questions.
What's your favorite color? Josh.
Who's your favorite boy band?
Bachelor number 1. If you were a cryptid, what would you be?
I'll be the Mothman. Because I've got big red glowing eyes for you.
No. Adam, you assured me that the tone of this thing was going to be serious.
Well,
so just I will remind you from time to time.
okay, we'll try to get a little more glum for you, Randall. If that's
I think Randall and I got all our good ideas out in the car, actually.
Yeah. The podcast actually started earlier. It's already peaked. All right, Josh, we'll start with you, sir.
Okay.
I've not had the chance to talk to you on the podcast about your trip to Ireland. First of all, why'd you make the trip? And what were you hoping to find out there that deal with your subject area?
It was a real bucket list item for me. So I had the opportunity to come into a little bit of a financial windfall that sort of allowed me to take that step. Perspective, I guess, is really what I was sort of looking for. I've had a long-standing interest in, the fairy faith as it is, fairy folklore. But it's one thing to read about these things, and it's another thing to actually go to some of these places and see some of these structures, and really put in perspective as to what people were really talking about, which, for the most part, are early Christian, in some cases, of some stone circles and some stone tombs, Neolithic structures that have become associated with, this sort of idea of the little people. But it really did help to reframe a lot of the ways that I think about that particular subject that's really so interesting to me. It underscored in a lot of ways something that I was aware of, but I'd taken for granted, specifically the relationship between fairies and the dead. I'm also a fan of pub culture. And so I was like, I had this idea that I was going to find every pub that we can just crawl up like a cat by the fire. And as I've told other people, what fascinated me was that it was actually kind of interesting because it kind of demystified that. Like, I still pine for Ireland, but I don't necessarily pine for Irish pub culture because just like America, there are a ton of crappy bars. And so every pub is not like this wood-lined, gentleman's lounge with the fireplace and, we got some fairy boots on the mantle. It's not like that. It's like, no, this is a bar.
Darts.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Throwing darts, and the taps, all they have are like, the Guinness impressions and then Coors and Bud Light. And I'm like, wow. This is so this is the least sexy thing I can imagine. So, I spent my time in my share of time in some really nice pubs over there, but it was nice to, sort of be like, oh, I don't have to be sad that I don't live over here. Although I tell you what, it was astoundingly, achingly beautiful. And
what part of Ireland were you in?
So we sort of did the real whirlwind tour. We went from Dublin, and then from Dublin all the way up to Belfast on the first day. Then Belfast, Northern Ireland, so Country Antrim, all the way back down the coast, excuse me, to Galway. Then did Galway and the Burren, and then came down to Dingle, which is the westernmost point of Europe. Did the Dingle Peninsula, and then came back through Limerick, where we stopped at Loch Gur, which is really one of the most sacred sites in Ireland, continuously inhabited for 8,000 years. It's really sort of an Irish cultural heritage center that not a lot of people talk about, and it's lousy with fairy lore. Actually, one of the spots where I believe it's Knockfinnell. It's either Knockfinnell or Knocknadoon, but I believe it's Knockfinnell. It's supposed to have an entrance to Tirnanog, to fairyland. And supposedly every 7 years there's a city at the bottom, a fairy city at the bottom of the loch that rises up. So spent just a day there, which was a nice change of pace, and then our final day back in Dublin. So we missed the entire bottom half, that sort of Cork area, which I need to go back and catch next time, in addition to spending some time in Scotland. So that's the next goal. But I can definitely die a happier man now after doing that.
Did you hit Newgrange?
Yeah, we did a Nowth. So Newgrange and Nowth. The Newgrange tickets were all sold out until 4 p.m. or something, and we had a bunch of other stuff that we wanted to do that day. But we hit Nowth, which is sort of remarkable in and of itself. I believe it's like a full third. I said this statistic before, and it's escaping me, but I believe it's a full third of the Neolithic artwork in Europe is found at that particular site. And of course, it's stuff like spirals, triangles, lines in the sky, circles, it's basically a bunch of UFO imagery / altered state imagery that you find on these rocks. And that makes it very apparent to me that it's very similar. At Loch Gur, actually, we went to the Grange Circle, which is not Newgrange, but the Grange Circle, which is down there at Loch Gur, which is the largest stone circle in Ireland. And had a wonderful tour guide from the Loch Gur Heritage Center, Michael Quinlan, talked to us and just spent some time with us. And I knew I was with the right guy when he goes, "Have you ever heard of ley lines?" And I'm like, "Boy, howdy, buddy." Have I ever heard of ley lines? And, we sort of talked about the sort of UFO altered state thing with an Irish archaeologist, which was sort of an interesting conversation that I don't think you'd find with a lot of stateside archaeologists. And he himself had apparently experienced interesting things. There was a hill that he pointed to in the distance and claimed that as a child he had gone into and found a secret passageway with a secret church, that if you knocked on a certain part of the wall or you looked at the wall a certain way, you could find this secret passageway to this little chapel inside this hill. And of course, I'm standing there going, "Well, what are you waiting for, dude? Let's go." He's 80, and it's half a mile away, and it's rainy, so it's like, okay, I get it. We won't go. Maybe next time. But it was. I will never forget a lot of that experience.
So you also went to see all these mounds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's some of the lore behind these mounds? What makes these places so special?
Well, after going there, so supposedly fairy raths, fairy leos, fairy forts, fairy mountains, there are different structures that are associated with the fairy folk throughout Ireland. Some of them are actual stacked stone forts. Some of them appear as hillocks. Some of them appear as rings of rocks with some trees in the center. Some of them actually appear as ring forts, is what they're also called, which is a mound of earth with a trench and an actual hillock in the middle. So you learn to sort of catch these sort of different variations on it. They are unambiguously human structures. They're unambiguously, usually the date that people put around them is usually the people cite that they're part of their sort of early Christian era. But they
could be older, like Neolithic age.
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of some blending between even older structures and these other in these sort of these other structures that I'm referring to. A lot of them were used by later settlers for housing their livestock and whatnot, but they became associated with the fairy faith. They were bad places to go at night. If you were to enter, you might come out, fairy struck, which means, sick or in a daze, or you might never come back at all because you're dead or been taken by the fairies. They're unambiguously human, though, which is something that, they're unambiguously human, so they weren't necessarily built by the fairies. But if you begin to really understand the Celtic fairy death, land of the dead cosmology, it begins to make more sense where this connection comes in. So the real question that emerges from that is that are these places of power because there is an ancient site there, or were these ancient sites built on places of power? Sort of a chicken and the egg thing. Mm-hmm. Supposedly, I've heard anywhere from, I believe, like 30 to 60,000. I might be getting some of my numbers wrong, so forgive me. But I believe 30 to 60,000. I know that 60,000 is an estimate that I've heard for how many of these sort of fairy structures are on Ireland, which is about the size of Indiana. So you can imagine how dense sort of how densely they're scattered about the landscape. The unfortunate thing is that most of the time when you're traveling through the landscape, you're in a low car with hedges on either side, so it makes it difficult to see. And then, on top of that, not all of them are super obvious. But I think I visited about 6 different fairy sites, and from the car saw about 3 others that were pretty unambiguously exactly what I was looking for. And that was just with me, like, sort of getting an eye for it, and sort of over the course of 10 days knowing what to look for.
Are these places pretty accessible, or are they on private land, public? Like, what's the mixture there?
It's a mixture.
You know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I know exactly where you're going with this. So it's a mixture.
How many fences did you have to climb over?
There might have been some light trespassing over an electric fence.
Did you have any angry Irishmen trying to shoot you or anything?
No, it was the weirdest thing. So I was aware of this one fairy fort that was supposed to be in this area of the Burren, and we had looked for it and we couldn't find it. And there was this like 1-lane dirt road leading off, and I'm like, let's just go down there and see what's down there. And on the way down there, we come across this Irishman walking down the road, because there's I've never seen a populace so comfortable with walking through the countryside, just on a road as I did in Ireland. Yeah. He stops and we chat for a while, and we talk about a fairy fort, and he's like, "Oh yeah," he talks about like some sort of really like a fairy fort on down the coast that's all touristified up. And I'm like, okay. So he was coming towards us as we were driving down. I said, well, we'll come down here and turn around. And we come to finally where we get to a place to turn around, and it's farmland, and sitting right there is a giant, obvious fairy fort. And he catches up with us. I'm sorry, so I had that opposite. We were both going the same direction. He catches up with us, and I said, that's a fairy fort. And he looks and he goes, "Oh, I suppose so." So I think that it's just it's a part of the landscape that's so common to see that they don't really and of course they don't really not saying that they don't appreciate it, but it's not noteworthy to the average Irish person who isn't interested in this sort of thing. And it was on private land, so we waited for him to walk away, and we drove, and I watched my rearview mirror, and we backed up, and I climbed over the fence, which I found out was electric. The good news is that
To your chagrin.
To my chagrin, the good news is that a pair of blue jeans will actually mitigate the mild voltage.
That's good to know. Thank you.
If your hands grasp around it, though, it's a different story. And so I'm dodging cow patties, and I got in the middle. I basically trespassed on private land, but I went out there. I said my respects, left a loaf of bread that I'd stolen from the bed and breakfast. Not stolen, I'd taken from the bread and breakfast. A little tiny loaf of breakfast bread. Right? Like my criminal career in Ireland. And then, then came back. So, no harm, no foul. And it was, I don't know if I'm ever going to get back there. So I would, if anybody.
I would have loved to see the headline, "Fairy researcher arrested in Ireland for trespassing."
Yeah, exactly.
With like Josh's mugshot.
Yeah, basically.
Holding his tuba.
Oh no, man! You can't fly with the tuba. It's too much of a pain in the butt.
We actually have the tuba here.
Yeah,
we're actually staring at it right now.
It's staring at us one way or the other.
All right, Dr. Future has just come. He's here.
He's entered the building.
We'll have to get him.
Able to get any photographs?
Oh yeah,
good.
plenty. Yeah,
I'd like to see those sometime.
Yeah, some photographs and some videos too.
Oh, good. Okay.
Because it was, not only is it interesting to go for like the Fortean lore seeking, but you're there amongst some structures that are of an age that you just don't really run into that often in America.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of stone cairns that were just amazing to see, and so I'll definitely make sure to share. There's a Where Did the Road Go Patreon video that I compiled of about 20 minutes of me going to these different forts,
nice
sites, and talking about that. So I'll be sure to share that with you.
Nice. But Soraya liked that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and not only for patrons, but just for me as a memento. So I think I took like 1,400 photos in 10 days or something.
Okay, well, Irish trip aside, you also have a new book that is coming out here pretty soon.
Yes,
and I am super excited about this book.
I am too. It's different. The last two books were on food and drink encounters in Fortean. In Fortiana, and then the other.
Explain what Fortiana is for the audience, maybe if they don't know.
Sorry. So Fortiana is an easier way of saying weird stuff or anomalous things. You can't just say
named
UFOs
after Charles Fort.
Named after Charles Fort, historian and researcher that sort of wrote a lot of the foundational texts that have examined these sort of things. But Fortiana is a bigger catch-all that isn't just like, I'm a cryptozoologist, I'm a ufologist, I'm into, stories of time travel, I'm into, ancient mysteries, I'm into, anomalous falls of things from the sky. All these sort of fall under the umbrella of Fortiana. So it's easier to say Fortiana or Fortean things, Fortean studies, than to say anomalistics or weird things. It's a little bit more elegant than that. So yeah, thank you for asking me to clarify that. I always sometimes forget that I'm not in that world. The audience is giving me a thumbs up. My jacket.
The audience has grown to 3 now, so
it's swollen to 3.
Yep.
But so the first book was on the role of food and drink in some of these stories. Second book was on the consistency of odors in these stories, these sort of Fortean stories. And this one I decided
not very pleasant odors either.
No, I mean not solely sulfur, because there's a lot of other consistencies that you can find, but a lot of sulfurous smells.
Hey, can I mention a
sure.
popular incident where sulfur was smelled?
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember when Ahmadinejad spoke at the United Nations right after George W. Bush. He also said he detected sulfur in the air in front of the podium when he spoke. Is that right?
I've heard that people like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, and Obama, they leave a sulfurous smell in their wake.
Obama attracts flies.
Smells like the devil.
No, I did hear that too. Wait, was it Ahmadinejad or was it Hugo Chavez?
I think it was Ahmadinejad that time.
Okay.
No, we have 4. We have an audience of 4 now.
So and of course, something from the book, the smell of sulfur is sulfur actually has no odor. It's like sulfur compounds that have odor. So anyway, that's the rabbit hole that I went down with that. Anyway. Third book. So all these other books were sort of survey and analysis of these things. This third book is on paranormal child abduction, from the fairy faith through ufology, but also touching on subjects of Bigfoot and even sort of the missing 411 thing, but looking at changelings and the hybrid program, because, as someone who's interested in ufology, and who doesn't think that the hybrid program, quote unquote, is something that should be taken at face value, I had to say to myself, well, what do you think of this? If this doesn't fit with your cosmology, you need to actually need to wrestle with what you think this is. So I forced myself to do that, and it's a very different book, tentatively titled Thieves of the Night. Probably going to have a Sam Sheeran cover, which I'm excited about because I love his work.
Nice.
And coming out no later, I've been assured, than late summer 2018. So that's coming out soon, and it's if nothing else, it will be the most comprehensive fairy abduction collection since at least like some stuff that's come out in the 1940s.
Well, hey, we're gonna do an interview about this book for sure, but let's get like a teaser, like a couple of the stories from the book that you find particularly interesting. To put you on the absolute spot.
Put me on the spot without my document here. There's an interesting story told by an Irish storyteller by the name of I believe it was in Rise was the name of a young boy named Gitto Bach, Bach, in Ireland, who was fond of playing with the fairies, and he would always return with, as evidence, these little scraps of odd white paper. And he would always tell people that he was playing with the fairies, and no one really believed him until he didn't show up. And there was this giant search for him. No one showed up, and then finally, no one could find him, rather. And then finally, a year later to the day, he showed back up on the doorstep in the exact clothes that he was wearing, supposedly. You'll find that's sort of one of the more apocryphal stories, because there is a at the intersection of mythology and tall tales and actual accounts is where a lot of these things sort of sit. Adam's dying. Don't look at him. Oh, seriously, you okay, dude?
Yeah, I need a cough button. Holy!
I was thinking that earlier. Like, cough button.
Could you use the Heimlich over there?
I'm good.
I'll just smack his chest.
We'll bend you over.
Of course, I would like, start getting a cold on the 200th episode. That's
Do you need a shot of Hellboy Hellwater?
Yeah, I might need that. Yeah, sure.
But another one of my favorites. There's so many favorites that I found. Another one of my favorites, sort of from the alien angle, is this young girl who was out berry picking in France during World War II, rather. And of course, anybody who's familiar with the missing 411 things knows that there's a correlation between missing people and berries, and a very prominent history of people who are taken by the fairies when going berry picking. But in this case, this girl was berry picking in Nazi-occupied France, and she saw what was a shape about the size of an automobile with several short figures in brown jumpsuits standing there. Now, while they didn't necessarily explicitly take her away, there was a moment where she felt like everything around her froze and she had some missing time. So it's interesting because, if you take away the object that looked like a craft the size of an automobile, it sounds a lot like a fairy story too. So lots of little correlations like that here and there, and it goes over, not only the anecdotal stories, but means of protecting children from this, means of retrieving children from this, and also worldwide traditions, because there's a consistency throughout traditions in literally every inhabited continent that echo the fairy lore that you'll see in the Celtic countries.
For the audience, that they may not know some of this material. It's kind of the nexus between fairy lore, alien abduction phenomenon, and even Bigfoot encounters.
Yeah,
some of that connection that's there with that stuff.
Yeah, I personally have come to sort of accept the idea of like fairy lore as just an old fashioned way of saying the paranormal, because it encompasses so much. If you look at the modern alien abduction phenomena, setting aside lights in the sky, which might be something extraterrestrial legitimately, which might be unexplained natural phenomena, and which most likely, more often than not, are unorthodox terrestrial craft tests. Setting that aside, the abduction experience really mirrors a lot of the things that you see in fairy lore. The height of the beings, the places where people are taken sometimes, to round areas, sometimes areas underground. Often in these experiences, there's these multiple short beings supervised by a taller being. In the modern abduction accounts, it's the supervisor gray with the shorter gray aliens. In fairy accounts, it was the shorter fairies with the taller, more human-like fairy queen. You'll find the prominence of food in these sort of stories, anomalous light phenomena in these sort of stories. Both sets of entities could supposedly paralyze people. You find a lot of those similarities, but and that's been talked about, ad nauseum by people like Jacques Vallée and others. But
the passport to Begonia stuff.
Yeah. And although that wasn't really the first to really discuss a lot of these things, he definitely managed to bring a lot of that together.
Luke.
Nice. I'm so glad that's where I've been all this time looking for
mythical
Luke.
creatures.
Yeah, speaking of mythical creatures, here he is.
Where's my Chick-fil-A, man?
I destroyed it. There's no leftovers. It's done.
All the people that are listening to this is here. Luke saying, "I destroyed it."
I got some funny looks because of
nobody could hear you, dude.
I got some weird looks because of my personal
Shroud of Turin shirt, isn't it?
No, it's actually dehumanized.
Oh, yeah. I should have known.
It's got a nice little message on the back too.
Jesus was first.
All right. Well,
you make me look bad with my Shriek of the Mutilated shirt that I got on.
Did you get your Brogel?
Cheers, man. It's still
Yeah.
a pretty shirt.
Nice.
Rogel and
Pull your mic to you, Luke. We've only been doing this for 6 years.
I guess yeah.
It's all the mirth and merriment just happens whenever Luke is here.
Hey, I like the sigils on your shirt, on your hat too. That's pretty cool.
So continue, Josh. Before I knew when Luke showed up, he's going to get it completely derailed.
So the alien fairy link has been much celebrated, but what has been much ignored is the alien fairy is the fairy Sasquatch thing, which if you look at a lot of Celtic lore, it talks about fairies braiding horses' manes, happens and is attributed to Sasquatch today. You'll find, similar to alien and fairy tales, people feeling paralyzed in the presence of Sasquatch. Supposedly, some people claim that Sasquatch might live underground. There are similar smells involved. One of the interesting things that I thought was a fairy Sasquatch link is that there's a type of solitary fairy in the Scottish Highlands that's said to live called the Gilly. It's called the Gilly Doo, which is, it's this large, shaggy entity covered in detritus and, just leaves and, debris from the forest. And that's where we get the term ghillie suit. And this connection is not lost on Australian special forces, who call their ghillie suits yowie suits. And yowie is the Australian Bigfoot. So there's a fairy Bigfoot connection that not a lot of people talk about. Explicitly in sort of the British Isles, you'll see a taller, shaggy sort of fairy folk known as the Woodwoes, which appear in sort of iconography as the Green Man that you'll see.
Have you ever watched Bigfoot and Wild Boy?
No, well, what is that? I don't even know what that is.
Yeah, your research is incomplete if you've not watched Bigfoot and Wild. That was on Saturday morning. That was on Saturday mornings. Where I think it was this kid that got lost out in the woods, and Bigfoot raised him. Nice. And they would solve crimes, and they would, like, people were in distress.
This sounds amazing.
And Bigfoot would usually have to rescue Wild Boy because Wild Boy was a little more impetuous than Bigfoot was.
This sounds amazing.
It's based on a true story.
That's amazing. That reminds me of my favorite coast to coast call-in that I experienced, which was.
This is what you were on Coast to Coast.
Yeah, that's when I was on Coast, and I was talking about my first book about the food and drink offerings of things. It's been a very sober conversation, and somebody calls in and says, Yeah, I just wanted you guys to know that I was watching season 2 of Little House on the Prairie, and in the background you can see very clearly Bigfoot is riding a chariot across the stream. In episode 5 of season 2, it's Bigfoot on a chariot. And thank God Knapp was like, well, thanks, caller. That's great. Let's get back to something regarding the matter at hand. What the hell do you say to that, you know?
That was better than my experience on there, because George Norrie just wanted to talk about White Castles when I was a guest. That and where I worked in area on Wright-Patterson where the aliens were stored at one place, and he wanted to know about that the whole time rather than the topic
the aliens
of the book.
like White Castle?
Right.
Wow.
Anyway.
Well, Mike, I mean, you know where all the secrets are over there. Everybody knows.
I can't even confirm or deny that.
Right.
Although I did work with the guy known as the Hawk in the aviary.
Nice.
I did work with him regular, and I didn't know until after I'd worked with him that that's who he was, until he was outed on Coast to Coast, actually.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Ernie Kellerstrass.
My aviary bird would be the tit.
All right. Let's go over to Randall. Hello, sir.
Hello, Adam.
You just kind of just patiently listening.
Please elevate the conversation.
It's interesting stuff. I'm having thoughts as we go along here, thinking about, the connection with the landscape. Because when I was up there in the Glens in western New York, I was so reminded of Irish landscapes as I would picture them. And then come to find out that there's a rich fairy lore and little people and amongst the native peoples of that area. And so I thought that was very curious.
Yeah, I think that whatever the phenomena is, it's tied very much to the land. We were sort of talking about this a little bit today, but I think that the land plays an integral part in whatever this is, and, however true it may be. I think that the land plays a role, definitely.
The idea that there may be certain qualities to certain landscapes that can actually induce perceptual changes or changes in consciousness. That was kind of the idea we were about on the way up here, because it certainly does seem like forces, geomagnetic forces that we know can affect consciousness, and we know that those geomagnetic forces can be altered by shifts in the landscape, tectonic plates moving, stresses propagated along fault lines can set up fluctuations in the geomagnetic field. And we know that that can have impacts on human consciousness, human perception. So there may be some basis to this idea that there's a link between human consciousness and landscapes that would be conducive to having certain kinds of experiences. And I think Paul Devereaux did a lot of that kind of work, showing the connection between geological formations and Fortean types of phenomena. And we were talking earlier about Persinger and the work Space-Time Transients and Unusual Events that goes back to the 70s, where they saw a very powerful statistical correlation between certain geological structures and Fortean events, particularly structures that are known to have measurable and quantifiable energetic properties, particularly along fault lines.
Speaking of that, what about other ingredients or elements that could be in geology? For example, like radon, uranium, things like this, magnetic, other components of the soil. Could that have an effect on the collective psychology of communities in those areas?
I would certainly not be dismissive of an idea like that. Getting into particularly, and the types of minerals and metals that to find their way into the biosphere, into the food we eat, the water we drink, and we were talking about this earlier. Because so much of the water comes from underground that we consume, and when water is flowing underground, it takes on the properties of the material that it's flowing through, and it can literally, take up minerals and have mineral content that is unique to the particular rock types that it's flowing through, and we drink that water. And
it's a sobering thought when you think that the largest creatures on this planet are mushrooms. Like the largest footprint.
Yeah.
And those who have hallucinogenic components to them could pervade the whole ecosystem of a region through the water supply, and not only humans, but animals. and everything else in a whole region could have a common dose from what's right under their feet.
The possibilities here are pretty mind-boggling when you begin to contemplate not only what hard science is showing to us, but what we can also now, with that context, look back at some of what our ancestors were doing thousands of years ago in a whole new light, a whole new context, and go, okay, this isn't just some superstitious, meaningless thing that they were doing out of ignorance, but they actually knew what they were doing, and it was specific actions designed to have specific results. And this is what they were doing, because there so many of the sacred structures all over the world are built over underground water, and where oftentimes water will surface. And springs have always been a place of particular sanctity. And many of the pagan sites were based around springs. And then when they became Christianized in Europe, the Christians took those over and built abbeys and monasteries and cathedrals on top of the old pagan sites. Chartres Cathedral is well known to have, it has a well that you can, if you go down in the crypt, there's a deep well there, and that well feeds into this underwater stratum. And there's actually several underground watercourses that intersect under where the high altar used to stand. Things like this could be coincidence, or it could be part of the design of the thing. It was done with intent.
Well, if you think about other forms of matter that have that effect from the ground, probably one of the most famous ones I can think of is the Oracle at Delphi, who actually had the gases released, when they had the little tripod suspended over it. That had an effect on the whole world, because people from around the world came to get the wisdom, kings and everyone else, based upon exposure to what was down there. That's all internal. If you look external, I think you could trace most of the well-documented, what we would call idols in the world, or other kind of relics, even at the Kaaba, are things that appear to be extraterrestrial, in that meteorites or things that have some other bizarre properties. They took note of it and knew it wasn't normal for their environment, and it maybe even changed their behavior and response when they were around them. And, of course, our literary fields have made so much about that, about people being changed, whether it's the color, what was Lovecraft's, the color outer space or something like that. But there's so many variations on that theme that have touched into that, and probably old legends where something interloped in that looked like a natural structure, but everything changed after that.
Yes, well, I mean, the things from space that interact with Earth are loaded with all kinds of interesting exotic materials. And so when you have an impact, there is a type of cosmic alchemy that can alter the whole trajectory of the biosphere on the planet. And when an impact like that happens, basically for a short period of time, it'll strip away the ozone layer and allow cosmic radiation to come in. It will deposit platinum group metals into the rock substructure, and it'll fuse those cosmic materials like the ruthenium and zirconium and iridium and platinum with terrestrial materials. At the same time, it will cause a major fracturing of the crust, which now allows the subterranean water to pick up those exotic materials and convey them throughout the substructure. They emerge from the ground and in the form of springs, and the vegetation begins to form around the springs. And so I think we're looking at kind of a type of cosmic alchemy there that and
in the legends of the people, all they would know is they saw something fall from the sky, and suddenly they perceived things differently, and things changed around their environment. They perceived.
It makes you wonder what would have happened if Oumuamua had passed a little bit more closely to Earth. Oumuamua,
the one that was coming. Right? Yeah, you're saying it right. Okay. The one that was coming from outside the solar system.
The interstellar object that passed, cigar shape.
Oh, right. Yeah, that thing.
Covered in some sort of organic material that no one has really talked about.
How did they determine that? I'm not sure. Certain how that was actually determined, but well, I want to ask you this, since we're on this subject, and this jogged my memory about this. I watched this documentary called Patient 17 on Netflix, and it was about this guy that was it was Dr. John Lear, and he was going to see Roger Lear, the guy, the podiatrist that did the alien implant stuff. So he takes out, they take out these alien implants, and I don't know what this is, since I'm not extraterrestrial hypothesis person. I don't actually believe that it's extraterrestrial, but in actuality, it really is, because they do this analysis of it, and they have all these different elements that come from not necessarily outside the solar system, but just not on Earth. So, any thoughts about what that could be coming from you guys' different points of view?
I mean,
like it's baffling
to take a Patrick Harper daemonic reality sort of view of it.
Mm-hmm.
These things which reflect, which sort of are reflections of Jungian archetypes, have the ability to manifest real, substantial objects and reactions from our physical world. If you look at, for example, the fairy faith, there are tons of what are called fairy artifacts, fairy boots, fairy jerkins, fairy flags. every time, man, it follows me around on every podcast.
And you know that it's true.
Fairies wear boots. But do I think that these are actual like little artifacts from little people? No, I don't. But I suspect that they, alongside something like what are so-called implants, might exist on that sort of same spectrum of something being able to create a measurable artifact in our world. But at the same time, like as those words come out of my mouth, that's like the least scientific possibility ever. You know,
Sure.
I mean, it's predicated on a lot of.
You also have the apport phenomenon too, which is very similar,
right,
in a way, to this alien,
as
quote unquote, alien implant
as far
thing.
as the implants, I saw something like that on TV once, on SCTV, where the aliens came, and when it took them over, it looked like a leaf of cabbage on the back of their neck. Do you remember that? It took over Eugene Levy. That was another one based on a true story too. I don't know if y'all saw it. I think John Candy should come.
I love me some SCTV. I do. But you know, it's so that's like the esoteric of the most esoteric hypotheses. Which at that point, if you're gonna extrapolate that much, you might as well. It actually is easier to say extraterrestrial implants, you know, from literal aliens. So I'm willing to sort of make that caveat. I'm sure Randall has something much more sophisticated to say.
About that particular subject, no, I don't have anything particularly awesome to contribute to that. I was wondering, though, when you did your book on smells, and I've always been curious about the connection between the olfactory sensation and your memory processes. Because I know, and probably a lot of people have experienced this, certain smells. I mean, for me, it's almost like I'm transplanted.
That's been
like
documented.
A time machine.
Scientists have said that is the one sense more than any tied to your memory. They've confirmed that the smell is.
It's that Proustian idea that some sort of sense can sort of bring you back, and it's not necessarily so much about remembering, it's more about not forgetting, if that makes any sense in terms of the way that it's wired in your brain. There are certain smells will be coded to certain life events and certain expectations, and it really is sort of a shortcut for the brain to know when it's in a bad situation, or in a good situation, or what to expect. You know, I would argue one of the big things that Terence McKenna would talk about was how you know, we think of telepathy as it's depicted in popular culture as hearing someone else's thoughts in your brain as like a narrated sort of form. And his take was that telepathy would be much more elegant if it was something where it was just a sense of immediate knowing. And he compared sort of the way that octopi share moods with textures and colors as being a much more elegant form of telepathy, because immediately, instead of actually processing a sentence from someone else's brain, you immediately know that particular mood or thought that this other octopus is having. And he claimed that this would sort of be even a superior form of communication to something like telepathy. However, I would posit that you know, if there was some sort of force that wanted to convey an emotion immediately and without question, it could actually harness the power of smell, because that way you don't even have to process it. It's a gut reaction. It's a visceral thing. You can't help but be taken back to a certain place because of it.
So do you have any particular smells in your if you get a
So no smells, right? No smells. But I remember the first time I ever had peanut butter pie. I tried peanut butter pie. I was 10 years old and I'd never seen Planet of the Apes, right? And Charlton Heston is standing trial in front of Dr. Zaius for his crimes, and it's just like, look, I was 10. Come on, so it was like
it's sort of like remembering the JFK assassination where you were.
Yeah,
at that time, right?
When
Zaius was
it was such a bleak. It was such a bleak and I didn't know the ending, and it was sort of a bleak scenario, and I will, to this moment associate the taste of peanut butter pie with this sort of nihilistic, you blew it up sort of ending. So
you have some tastes, but not any particular smell.
No, but like you can't deny like that there's a very strong relationship between smell and taste.
True.
Yeah. So I mean, so it's kind of the same thing.
Well, yeah, because you can't taste things properly if you're holding your nose.
Right. Like, to me, tequila smells like college, so there's that.
Immediately communicating with somebody else, something about them from just smell and getting all that. I have been told that about other people toward me because at various times when they smelled me, they'd say, Mike, you've had chili today, or something like that. So they've known those things. But, one thing I was thinking about the
senses... Who knew Dr. Future was going to bring the comedy?
I got a big old bowl of chili today.
Oh, no, I hate that. But speaking of smell, just pondering that idea of the other senses, I would guess that most likely smell is probably one of your senses least likely to lie to you.
Yeah.
And least deceptive over all the other senses.
For that reason, it was sort of looked down upon by a lot of early philosophers because, by some philosophers it was regarded as more pure. In fact, I think Aristotle was one of the ones who said that this is where we get the phrase "the nose knows" and a rose by any other name. But in some senses, it seemed to some philosophers it seemed more base and animalistic. Freud posited the idea that the reason that we place less of an emphasis upon smell as a society is because we graduated from being four-legged, more primal animals smelling each other's genitalia.
Some of us.
We rose from the ground. We rose from the ground, and as we rose, we placed less of an emphasis on smell because it was deemed to be a more animalistic sense.
And yet, an animal can come up and can smell when you have cancer, when we don't have a clue what's going on.
Yeah, they used to say dogs couldn't do that, but they actually can.
But in our literature, we always will use I smell a rat.
Yeah.
Or I have something, and we use in our nose, we know it's something that'll tell us what our other senses have. Even if you hold your nose or it's stopped up, your taste buds will lie to you. Mm-hmm. You totally lose a sense of what your food is. Your eyes can lie to you. New World Order relies on that. So all of these things except the sense is pretty good.
Well, but there are some caveats to that. So, people who are blindfolded and presented with Parmesan cheese and told that it is.
Yeah, you talk about this in the book. Yeah.
Said that it's Parmesan cheese will be delighted, but you can hold Parmesan cheese in front of someone's nose and tell them that someone vomited, and it elicits a completely different reaction because they're the same sort of acids involved in both, in vomit.
Well, we know there's crossover. It doesn't mean like everyone has a unique. Like for example, a lot of times black coffee smells like vomit or BO to me, and even like a hot pizza, as good as it is, sometimes smells like body odor when I smell it. So that means that you can't always assign each individual thing in life to an individual smell. There's a little overlap in the indexing system.
Right. It's sort of like more like a matrix of senses working together.
Right. I think we need to test this.
We need some pizza.
It smells to me like we're testing it now.
That might happen at some point.
I wasn't going to say anything, but
I'll bring the BO right now.
Randall.
Yes, Adam.
Very interesting that I have you here in the studio because
how did you manage that?
I know, man. I know. It was a lot of negotiations with my people and your people. And Josh, what are you trying to do to me over here?
Yeah. Well, you told me, you assured me that you would feed me. So
yeah.
Little lap dance never hurt anybody, Adam.
Actually, Adam, I have been wanting an excuse to get up to this area and explore Nashville.
Absolutely.
You gave me that excuse.
Absolutely.
So
hopefully we'll get to do some of that tomorrow.
Good.
Hey, Adam, what is Old Stone Fort Archaeological Park?
It is it's like an ancient Indian Native American structure that was built in prehistory.
Excursion, Randall?
Yeah, it's over there by, it's in between, it's like roughly about like right between here and Chattanooga. So it's about
How
an
far is it
hour.
off the interstate?
5 minutes.
Nice.
Yeah, let's hit that.
Yeah, you
Well, now,
should
if
go
you're
over
going
there.
why don't you go to Frozen Head State Park? Have you ever been there?
Ain't
on
no head
on
like
I-40?
Frozen Head.
Have you ever been to Frozen
No,
Head State?
tell me about it.
I don't know. I see signs for it on I-40 between here and Knoxville.
Frozen Head.
And I don't know whose Frozen Head it is, where they keep the Frozen
It's Walt
Head,
Disney's.
but it's a state park, and it's Frozen Head State Park. But I don't know if it's like
let's see.
Who wrote the book That Hideous Strength? The C.S. Lewis,
Yeah.
about the head that was decapitated. I don't know if it's
Well, it
related
sounds
to
like
that.
we need to make a field trip, Mike.
I know. Well, why don't
We
you
need to go to Frozen
record a
Head.
show from Frozen Head State Park?
Yeah, we'll have a ritual at Frozen Head.
If I could do it from the Kelly Greenman reunion, you could
That's
do
true.
Guys, do the headless rite at Frozen Head.
There you go.
That would be the bomb.
But I want to read
I'll
this
let you guys
because your work on cometary impact, Randall,
Oh, yeah.
is now, I mean, this has been like your thing now, I think, for what, over 20 years that you've been talking about this?
Mid-'80s.
Okay, so a good while.
Time is
I can't pinpoint it exactly, but somewhere between mid-'80s and early 90s.
Right.
The scenario gelled pretty much.
And so this is...
basically, the evidence has been out there all this time.
Yeah.
Right.
This is beginning to be, apparently is beginning to be really taken seriously, because this is from ScienceDaily.com. I saw this on the internet. Just someone randomly, other than anybody that we know, I saw somebody post this. Randomly posted it. Yeah, randomly. Yeah.
Randomly.
So I'll read a little bit of this. On a ho-hum day some 12,800 years ago, the Earth had emerged from another ice age. Things were warming up and the glaciers had retreated. Out of nowhere, the sky was lit with fireballs. This was followed by shock waves. Fires rushed across the landscape and dust clogged the sky, cutting off the sunlight. As the climate rapidly cooled, plants died, food sources were stuffed out, and the glaciers advanced again. Ocean currents shifted, setting the climate into a colder, almost ice age state that lasted an additional 1,000 years. Finally, the climate began to warm again, and people again merged into a world with fewer large animals and a human culture in North America that left behind completely different kinds of spear points. Okay, that's all I'm going to read on that.
Okay.
But I think everybody gets the gist on that.
Yeah, there was the Clovis culture that preceded the impact at about 12,008, somewhere between 12,800 and 12,900 years ago. They disappeared, and in most places around North America where they had a strong cultural presence, there was a gap of anywhere from 300 to 900 years. And
they're called the Clovis culture because this was the spear points that were found first at Clovis, New Mexico.
Clovis, New Mexico.
Which we passed right through there on our way to Roswell.
Blackwater Draw was the site. Yep. It was one of the early man sites, the first in America to show a correlation between extinct megafaunal remains and human activity, particularly spear points. In fact, there was a mammoth skeleton found with an embedded spear point in it. And it's interesting that this whole idea of the human predation as being the cause of the great megafaunal extinctions at the end of the Ice Age has been predicated upon that particular find and maybe two or three others, which really is quite a scant amount of actually hard evidence to then infer from that human hunters exterminated over 100 species of megafauna at the end of the last ice age. But that is now a politically acceptable explanation because of the fact that we are now in the Anthropocene and humans' activity is supposedly now going to cause the sixth great mass extinction in the history of the planet, which...
I'd say we're a little more advanced than then, though,
Yeah, well, yes. Well, first of all, anyone who's familiar with the conditions, the planetary conditions during the Great Five would know that this is not really, in other words, the sky has not been black with dust choked for 6 months. There has not been global firestorms.
Just wait till March, though.
Yeah, well, in March, we're getting ready for that.
Yeah, after the Olympics.
Oh, what happens in March?
Well,
my birthday.
I know the head of the CIA back in September 20th. He says within 6 months we're going to war with North Korea, and I didn't realize. Well, of course, there's been so many about Iran, for 15 years and not happened, but I suddenly realized why they would pick March, because the Seoul area Olympics will be over this month, so. We need a wag the dog scenario. So, you might have to amend the formula in a month and a half, so get all the mileage out of it you can until that.
Well, yeah, I don't know if there's enough megatonnage in the North Korean arsenal to get to the scale of
I'm not really worried about their megatonnage, but I get your point.
Yeah. But, yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed, because I don't think it'll serve our purposes to unleash the nuclear weapons after all these years. God, that doesn't need to happen.
Unless
there's
we need
no
to get,
foreign policy objective that's worth that.
Well, you got to get something off the headlines. That may be the only reason to use it.
2 minutes to midnight.
Alien invasion. That's the only reason.
The IAEA. It was the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists. I'm sorry, they just upped the clock to 2 minutes to midnight.
Yeah, but that wasn't all just based on nuclear. That was also
climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But
mass extinction, though.
Yeah. So yeah. What do you figure if you go to basically the scholarly sources of human population dynamics back into the Paleolithic, what you see is that during the end of the Ice Age, estimated human population globally might be 5 million people, and there were 10 million woolly mammoths. Right. And that's just one. Okay, so how can small bands of perhaps 25 or 30 hunters on foot with stone-tipped spears exterminate the entire race of 4 species of proboscideans or elephants that occupied the earth at that time? But they don't want to go to the idea of a comet, because now you see the idea that humans are causing the 6th great mass extinction plays into certain political agendas of basically social control.
And we have this self-flagellation urge as a species.
And it fits right in with the thing that we are going to cause catastrophic climate change. It fits, the two are very compatible with each other into this notion that humans are a pariah on the earth, and therefore all of our activities have to be controlled from cradle to grave. And every bit of our production, distribution, and consumption has to be controlled, because if we don't, we're going to have this carbon dioxide-induced climate catastrophe. But my point is that when you actually study the extreme nature and magnitude of these previous extinction events, of which there have literally been hundreds, we're not in anything quite like that at the present. I'm sorry to say.
So how do you think it will play out? How will another extinction and recovery happen based on what you see?
Well,
in the
both.
progression?
I mean, the mass extinctions that we've seen are triggered either by exogenic or endogenic forces. Endogenic meaning from within the planet. So you might have extreme volcanic eruptions that can cause total climatic and environmental breakdown on a planetary scale, or exogenic, meaning from outer space. And exogenic, I think, is the dominant one, because it seems like there's a high degree of correlation between the great impact events in Earth history, then followed by major volcanic episodes.
What about massive solar flares or something like that?
Could be, yes, and that could be another one. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because that could very well be another factor, as well as things like nearby supernovas. There could be a whole host of cosmic things that our ancestors recognized that we've forgotten about, only because we've managed to build this 5,000 year of history during a cosmically quiet period of time.
The weird thing about supernovas is that if that were to happen, to be our death shot or something close to it, it would have probably happened many, 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 many years ago from now, and our killer shot is just taking its time getting to us.
Yeah.
If it's a supernova, which is sort of a sobering thought.
My thought is that the main way that even a supernova whose shockwave itself is not enough to seriously impact the Earth or the inner solar system could have effects on the outer zone of the solar system, where the reservoir, the Kuiper disk, or the Oort cloud of comets, which we were talking about this earlier, are so delicately poised between our sun and the nearby solar neighborhood, and it takes only a slight impression to dislodge them from that position of quasi-stability that they're in, and sending them spiraling towards maybe a near star or right into the sun. If you have a nearby supernova, it could be that that's followed by a 100 or 200,000 year period of enhanced cometary influx to the inner solar system, and Earth could then be subject to what you would think of like comet storms. And the dating now of these celestial events, the impact type events, appears to be clustering in a sort of a periodicity. In other words, they're not just happening uniformly through Earth history, but they're bunched. You see, like the Cretaceous impact that wiped out the dinosaurs may have had 6 or 10 impacts all within a very short period of time. And so it may have not been one single impact that did the job, but it may have been multiple impacts. And we know that there are geomagnetic field collapses that have happened regularly, and they're being correlated now with great impact events. And the great volcanic extrusions, like the formation of the Columbia Basalt Plateau in the Pacific Northwest, the creation of the Siberian traps in Siberia, which correlates precisely now with the Permian-Triassic event and the greatest mass extinction in Earth history, or the extrusion of the Deccan traps, which seem to have been associated with the impacts of the Cretaceous Tertiary event that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. So it looks like there's this whole cosmic factor that we're now recognizing as an intrinsic part of Earth history. And that, I think, is where the direction we need to go. And I mean, if we're thinking long-term about the survival of our particular civilization and ensuring that it doesn't go the way of dozens of other civilizations that have preceded us, we need to be taking that into account.
Well, yeah, for me, the three most criminal things that our leadership as a species hasn't prepared us for are the Yellowstone supervolcano,
which isn't the only one.
Another carrying, well, yeah, so supervolcano events, things like the Carrington event, and asteroidal impact. I think those are three things that should be a priority for us that will really catch us with our pants down if they actually happen.
Yeah, and these are all arguments for colonies on other planets, at least to increase our odds.
I would say we could start. We've got an obvious direction to go because we have a satellite of Earth, which would be the first obvious place to basically, that's where we need to back up everything. Right. Back up our entire knowledge base. Our scientific base needs to be backed up on the moon, which is only about 1/80th as susceptible to cosmic impact as Earth, because of its smaller cross-section and its much smaller mass.
Well, plus, since it's tidally locked, the exposed to the outside on the far side would get most of the brunt. The Earth would actually protect the side that
the near side
that faces itself. The only thing that would be so bad is if it was so cataclysmic that it affected the orbit of Earth. We might lose the moon somewhere, but it would still be good insurance, like you say, to have it as a backup data source and technology and some kind of means on how to get it back from there.
Well, interestingly, you said if the impact was of that extreme magnitude and we lost the moon, and that's, you couldn't say absolutely that couldn't happen. But when you look at the density distribution of the cosmic entities that are out there, the bigger you get, the less probable the encounter becomes. Actually, what I think is the most dangerous threat to us in the near future would be smaller scale things that come in swarms.
Like a Tunguska event?
Like a Tunguska, yes, like a Tunguska of 1908 event, but a swarm of them, you see. And this is much more likely than a single big impact, because we know that comets come into the inner solar system and they have a life cycle. They disintegrate over a period of anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 years as they orbit the sun. And as they disintegrate, they litter the inner solar system with the byproducts of their debris. And Earth can pass through these streams of cosmic debris. And we know now for certain that it has done it in the past. And this is, I think, the most likely explanation for what happened 12,800 years ago, that we probably passed within the tail of a large disintegrating comet nucleus and got multiple impacts. And the work that I've been doing for the last well, since the late 90s, is trying to determine the locus of those impacts. And most of the criticism that has come, and there's been an organized effort to discredit this idea of a major cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. And it's coming from these defenders of this status quo interpretation that, human hunters exterminated the woolly mammoth. So they're putting this meme out there that this idea that humans have been the cause of this mass extinction 12,000 years ago, and then this is now being offered as Exhibit A in making the case that humans are now repeating that and saying, see, we've already done it. Well, now here comes the Comet Research Group and says, no, it was from something from outer space. See, they're already heavily invested in the political idea of humans causing a mass extinction. So they find the idea of a cometary impact very unpalatable. And they organized an effort to do everything they could to discredit this idea. When it was first proposed in 2007 by Richard Firestone and his colleagues, I think there was about 7 or 8 of them that authored that first paper. The Comet Research Group now has grown to over 50 members. And I had the opportunity last fall to go to and spend in a roundtable with 5 of the members, 5 of the authors of that paper that has just come out that they were talking about.
This is the University of Kansas paper? I read the article
Journal
about
of Geology paper that was referenced from.
Gotcha.
Several of those, like Christopher Moore, he told me, he said, well, I came in to debunk this idea. But once I came in and I started looking at the evidence, I'm now on board with it. And he wasn't the only one. Mark Dimitrov said the same thing. He came on as a skeptic. Same thing. They begin to look at the evidence, and it's been growing in credibility every year. And now the newest paper, back-to-back papers coming out, is basically now proving that at 12,800 years ago there was a global firestorm.
Well, let me ask you this. It seems like to me then there's another controversial area when we talk about colonizing other remaining planets, and that's the idea of terraforming. Because just like the political correctness of mankind being bad and doing these things, and I have data to suggest that. The same thing about us polluting other worlds with our activities. It seems like to me an argument that I just thought of because of your talk about a justification for terraforming is to get good practice on terraforming planets, because one day we may have to do it for our own. In other words, we might have to recover. It seems like to me the weak link in our ecosystem is our atmosphere. That we're really in bad shape. I mean, we can purify water if it gets polluted or other things, but if we lose part of our atmosphere or it gets really, really messed up, that's a hard thing to do. It might be a good idea to start practicing on Mars or even Venus, for example, to redo that simply because we might need to use it on Earth one day.
Venus provides a lot of easy solves for a lot of the problems that Mars has in terms of gravity.
Well, gravity, it's got ample energy. It's a lot easier to cool stuff down than to heat it up when you're that far. I mean, the runaway heat in Venus, there's been talk, and now I'm glad to hear just in the news they've revived the idea of the floating cities, which to me is a brilliant idea on Venus to do. You can add to as many as you want. But
Cloud City, maybe?
Well,
what have we here?
You start shading.
I'm Billy D.
You start shading that planet, and eventually over time, might be more than on my watch, but you could eventually start cooling off some things and have a very interesting possibility on Venus. It's a lot harder to make Mars warmer than it is to make Venus cooler, in my behalf. And that would certainly be handy in case we ever have to bring it back,
I have always been more gravitating towards sort of the O'Neill concept of getting outside of Earth's gravitational well and begin harvesting the raw materials that's already out there between the planets. Particularly what's interesting there is once we have taken an inventory of the cosmic neighborhood and we really know what's there, and we will, at this point, we only know about 10% of what's out there, right? In the immediate cosmic neighborhood, the stuff that could potentially affect life here on Earth, right? Okay, if we look at that stuff, what it turns out is that the most accessible is the stuff that's also the most dangerous because it's the stuff that's the closest to us. And when you consider, my grandfather, when he was a kid, the main mode of transportation on Earth was horseback or you walk. That was my grandfather. So a generation, 2 generations before me, right? He was born in the late 1800s. I was born in the mid-20th century. Just the things that I have seen since I was born in 1951. It's just phenomenal, right? Then the half century before that, same thing. Now, if we project another century from where we're at now, we could most definitely be harvesting asteroids. We could be processing the materials of asteroids, which everything that we are now extracting from the Earth through our mining operations is encased in those asteroids. All of the hydrocarbons, the precious metals, the rare earth materials, all of this water, right? Well, the O'Neill concept is that, look, once we get outside Earth's atmosphere, that is where solar energy is really going to come of age, because now you got access 24 hours a day, unfettered solar energy that could actually be driving orbital factories, right? We could, within a few generations, offload the entire industrial base of our modern civilization into orbit, thereby releasing the planet from the burden of carrying industrial civilization.
You're talking about American jobs over there.
Well, I am talking about American jobs, yes, sir. I'm talking about a realistic potential.
Then we might be one big rust belt at that point.
No,
I know what you mean.
At that point, we can be like Blade Runner, Earth to the Garden of Eden. Yeah. At that point, you see, and you figure 1 square meter of free space has 10 times the available solar energy that would be falling on a solar collector set out in the middle of the summer in Death Valley at high noon on a clear day. Multiply that by 10, and now that's the solar energy you've got once you get 5,000 miles out, you see. And there's no reason why, except for the fact that the lack of vision, the lack of motivation. Everybody's too consumed with bullshit. The crap that fills mainstream media that most people are thinking about and worrying about and stressing about in the long term.
You're here on that one.
Means nothing. Yep. Right? Yeah.
Well, it's the human nature thing. It's easy. Human beings are to couches and sitting and worrying as humankind is to the planet Earth and sitting and worrying. We all want to just stay. We'd rather stay sedentary and fret than actually get off our asses and do something.
Well, what we need is a repetition of Tunguska 1908, because what you had there was the detonation of a 15 megaton cosmic missile that came into the Earth's atmosphere, probably almost certainly a member of the Torrid Stream, because perfect timing of the year, came from the right place in space, right where the Torrid Stream would have been coming, the Torrid meteor stream. It blew up with the energy of a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb, flattened 890 square miles of old-growth taiga forest, which is essentially about the same area you would find within the perimeter highway of any major city in America, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Seattle, etc., right? Bring in a little 150 foot diameter cosmic missile like that, only instead of blowing it up over remote Siberia, drop it over a major city somewhere on Earth, and I guarantee it would be consciousness changing.
Well, I thought we had our wake-up call. What was it? Chernobylsk? Was it?
Chelyabinsk. Well, it wasn't enough. 1,500 people were injured, right? A couple of thousand buildings were damaged, but nobody, to my knowledge, was killed. Now, a Tunguska event happening over a major urban area, you would have several million people dying instantly. And you would have major destruction. I mean, the kind of destruction. See, it's interesting that Tunguska is like the lower level of the cosmic echelon, the cosmic hierarchy. It's at the bottom. It's the baby stuff. But interestingly, if we look at our own nuclear capabilities that we can now release energies, the very top of that is like the bottom end of the cosmic spectrum, the cosmic scale, if that puts it into perspective. See, our biggest hydrogen bombs are about equivalent to the smallest cosmic missiles that are detectable in the record. But now Tunguska, see, the thing you got to understand is about that, it didn't hit the ground. It blew up in the air. A shock 5 miles up, and that shock wave then came down and flattened. It splayed out that forest in every direction.
The way
does that work the same as a hydrogen bomb? That detonating it in midair is more effective.
It's more effective because the radius of damage is greater because less energy is absorbed by the impact. But even though it was an atmospheric detonation, there was a major seismic response that some estimate might have been up to about a 6.0 on the Richter scale. So that's very interesting. And it tells you what even a small impact into the Earth's surface, the kind of repercussions that could ensue from that.
Well, and Tunguska was seen and felt and heard from like incredible distances away.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean,
yeah, many thousands of square miles of. Yeah, because the thing passed over.
It was like a cosmic Krakatoa in that sense.
Yes.
I got a question for Adam on that. Adam, you remember the graphic novel Watchmen?
Yes.
And sort of the end of that, where there was sort of a false flag that was created to sort of
right. Yeah, in the graphic novel, it's an fake alien invasion.
I could see some creative, enterprising breakthrough captains of industry today that could almost artificially create something like this. For example, those same captains of industry today are really into the space program. They're really into trying to get a footprint on other planets and are very frustrated that there's minimal support for it.
To the stars.
Don't disparage Elon Musk in front of Rob.
Well, I'm not saying anything about anybody because there's multiple. All I'm just saying is it's in the realm of possibility that one of them could be so frustrated that something like this maybe could be false flagged to help promote what they consider to be a good response.
It's possible, but I think with what Randall, we're kind of in a turkey shoot.
Listen, if you're following the news about once a month now, we're seeing shit fly by us.
Yeah.
It's like, it's like the cosmos is constantly trying to get our attention and saying, look, people, look, your Earth is flying through a dense cloud of stuff in space. It's not empty like you imagined it was a few decades ago. It's highly populated with stuff flying around the sun, and the Earth is flying through that stuff.
I think there's a sort of an elegant spiritual metaphor if you acknowledge the concept of panspermia, which is gaining more traction amongst the scientific establishment. It's really elegant to me that this could be a planet, a life giver or a planet killer.
Both
extraterrestrial collisions.
I think it is both.
And I think there's an elegant spiritual metaphor in there too. Like I think that's really interesting to me that it's all about size and what it brings in terms of the role that it plays, either the giver of life or the taker.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always looked at it as sort of a metaphor for biological birth, because the comet is the cosmic spermatozoon coming into the ovum, the egg, which is the Earth. And once the egg gets fertilized, what does it do?
So you're talking about we need to build a big condom around it to keep from wiping it out.
Look, if I have a giant sperm, my wife don't blow up, dude. That's all I'm saying.
All right, you guys.
Let's get the comic relief in here. Dr. Future.
Present.
I want to know.
Hey, I want to just tell you, it is so exciting to be on here for your 2000th show. I just want to applaud you on it. That is incredible. 200.
1/3 of which has been you.
Did you say 200th and not 2000? Then why in the heck did I come here then if it was just 200?
You have done this before?
Yes. He's been live in the studio.
Don't you see the lines on my face?
He was here for
the life force sucked out of me.
Yeah, that's okay.
He was here for the 100th episode. He was here for the 50th. He was here for the 2nd.
33rd and a 3rd.
That's right. I mean, there's been a lot of Dr. Future out here.
Bring me a cookie.
Yes.
All this heavy talk is making me hungry. I can't wait for the pizza anymore.
Most people are taking a shot of liquor when Dr. Future comes on.
Yeah.
Stiff one.
Let's talk about what your book you're working on right now. And Rand, I want to get back to you because I got another question.
Okay.
I want to get to
after people hear Dr. Future, they're hoping for extinction events.
And and then we're going to open the line to the peanut gallery over here.
Okay.
At least one person has some questions.
Amen corner.
Chomping at the bit.
Well, I'm working on a different book than when I was on here long ago.
Yeah, you were only here back in December.
Right, end of December, so, right. I'm in a different universe now. I'm being nice to my Russian friends now. I'm done dissing them. That'll be out on the street eventually, so. Now I'm back to my old...
well, fill in for the audience the books.
The normal lineup of...
what you're working on, Randall and Josh, they haven't heard anything about it.
Multi-volume series as of now, the one I'm currently looking at probably just decided to split, so now it's going to be a full 10-volume series with the spinoff.
It keeps growing.
I know. Beyond all leaps and bounds. It's called The Holy War Chronicles, A Spiritual View of the War on Terror. And it grew from really being a documentation of what has happened in the most recent 2 decades since the War on Terror started, and what does it reflect about us as a culture, and particularly people of faith. And now it's grown into being the whole subject of religion-fueled wars, each from the time from Cain and Abel on to now. And it just turns out there's about 1,000 different facets to it, and each of those 1,000 have their own volume in this series. So I'm right at the penultimate right now, which is gathering together, having educated people on history through the different Abrahamic phase of their dirty laundry and stuff like that, and the history of our America and Western culture. I'm now focusing on who are some of the culprits right now, the rogues gallery. Are you taking photos over here?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so tired of the paparazzi.
I know. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to be you, Dr. Future. You have to dodge them all.
Right. And so I'm working now on the dubious characters, what we call the usual lineup of suspects of demagoguery, when somebody's ready to go chase the other, somebody who's different or different culture or faith. And I'm showing some of the bizarre motivations of some of these people, which is a real revelation, particularly for people like me, people of faith, who think they know who wears the white hats and who wears the black hats, and they take everybody at face value of what they say their motives are and what their purposes are, and in other words, extremely gullible and naive. And so I'm getting into some rather strange motivations that some of these people fighting the religious culture war are doing right now that most people aren't aware of. So,
what's the specific example of something that you're writing about in the book at this moment?
Well, I'm finishing one chapter right now that's about 270 pages. It's one of my longer chapters.
Wow.
In a book. And I talk with a guy a few people know about, Nicholas Papanikolaou. And he is sort of the crossroads where all Roman roads pass in terms of the more of the anti-Sharia, anti-Muslim, anti-Eastern culture. He actually is tied really close to a lot of the religious right televangelists, and has formed sort of a semi-secret chivalrous society, a special sect offshoot of the Knights of Malta, where these TV evangelists dress up like old crusaders and hold swords and knights. It's sort of like playing cowboys and Indians, but they're serious about it. And this just used to be the old nobility of Europe, whose time had long since passed, and they would do that to try to give each other titles of nobility and feel important again. These people are really more dangerous because they really have some agendas. They have pull within the government, particularly in our current administration. And in fact, you get toward the latter part of it, there's some very, very disturbing information I have with some gentlemen who are in control of things like the Family Research Council and things, that are former founders of Delta Force, that have lots of experience killing people with their bare hands. And evidently it's affect them psychologically, like a lot of people who do that kind of work. And they have given strong indications that they are actually doing vigilante activities on their own on a global scale, and things that they're now starting, sort of like our president now, they say is tweeting, basically. He's his worst enemy. Well, these guys have loose lips too. And for someone who's paying attention, they can connect the dots and find out that there are some things going on to destabilize the world now and lead us to a culture of civilizational crisis. And that all it takes is a few Jack D. Rippers, like, and Dr. Strangelove, to threaten everybody. And that's why I try to document those people and what they're up to now.
So what is their motive?
Well,
that's what I always come back to.
Right. There's several different motives. I'm a practicing Christian, so I have to say, I'm a person of faith. But if I really follow the founder of my faith, putting yourself last and putting others first, looking out for their interest before your own, are the most fundamental tenets of the founder of my faith. And basically what they've done is put everything on its ear. There's a paranoia, and in fact, the whole hard right culture that I've come out of, it's based upon paranoia. It's based upon rolling up your sleeves and defending yourself, all the things we were told not to do. For people who are secure in the afterlife and secure about a kingdom to come, it's not here, they have thrown away all of that, and they're going to fight for this earthly, fleshly kingdom, which is vulnerable to any space shot or anything else. They sort of traded in their birthright of a kingdom that can't pass for one that's really, really vulnerable. And if somebody else doesn't destroy it, well, they'll destroy it on their own. And that's to me, it's a definition of madness. But they feel so much that rather than to coexist along people who view things different than them, that they'd rather take out everything as part of it, which actually puts them in line with the people they're fighting. ISIS and the jihadists, they find themselves to be the same side of the same coin, just like in the Crusades. The only people more butcherous than some of these Saracens were the Crusaders that fought them.
Right.
And so there's a sickness, there's a spiritual sickness of mindset when you take up the sword and you don't listen to what Jesus said, put your swords down.
Well, I suppose there's a feeling of sort of being chosen or being sort of anointed as a crusader for these causes, right?
Well, and they anoint each other. The ones I document basically select each other to be noble knights. They handed each other titles of nobility. And in fact, they have gotten some religious right figures and made themselves archbishops, and in fact have manufactured a back history of apostolic succession. That means we are not to challenge at all what their views or perspective are right and wrong, because they claim that their legacy goes all the way back to the apostles, so therefore they shouldn't be challenged in whatever they lead us into. It gets extremely bizarre. In fact, it's really strange because some of the things we've talked about here, I would never think, talking about these kind of religious and political things going on, that I would get into exopolitics. But the same guys who run these things about fighting the Islamic menace and things like that, they're same people at their forums and roads overseas actually bring in exopolitics specialists. George Adamski, one of his main disciples, is one of these people that's part of it. So you talk about strange bedfellows. A lot of neo-Nazis, in the last section we talked about in Russia, in the last volume, when I was here at the end of December, they have a strong connection. The Russian Orthodox have their own holy war they're fighting against the West. And if you remember back in the Crusades, the big story of the Crusades was not the Christians fighting the Muslims. It was the Eastern Christians fighting the Western Christians. And most of the fighting was the East and the West Christians killing each other. And by the way, they got a little practice on the way of the Crusades by wiping out all the Jews in Germany on the way. And so the Muslims were almost an afterthought when they got there, just simply because they had some real estate they wanted. And so the same thing is going on in this situation too. But the Russians were closely tied to what we now know as the neo-Nazi movement here, the white nationalist movement. And that's why a lot of the guys that were at Charlottesville, just before that happened, I had been writing about them because they had been in St. Petersburg being trained by the Russian Orthodox Church to do this activity to destabilize the U.S., which was very, very disconcerting in what they're doing in Eastern Europe. So you talk about entering into a cloud of extraterrestrial debris. We are in a cloud of cultural debris right now in our society, and it's equally hazardous of our own self-immolation before we have any kind of asteroid get here and do it to us.
You may not have these numbers, but are there any current estimates on the actual prevalence of the rise of neo-Nazism in the U.S.?
Of the numbers of neo-Nazis?
Yeah, and to paint that term broadly, like how many people are white supremacists, KKK members, and neo-Nazis? Is there any sort of estimate on that?
It's funny you'd ask me that. I should have that on the tip of my tongue. I don't have it exactly. I think I probably had documented my writing, but I'll give you a couple related numbers.
Sure.
I was just writing about the people of my religious background, the Southern Baptist. I don't currently attend one, but raised in this part of the country, there's good odds if you're going to be raised in a Christian home as Southern Baptist, something like it. I was just writing the other day documentation that 14% of all Southern Baptist pastors are Freemasons, which is a complete rebuttal of the staunch heresy hunter behavior that they have and these kind of things. Going back, let's just say the 1920s. There's one piece of data that comes to mind. 1920s. Let me see if I get this right. one out of every seven males in America was a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow. So wait, I'm missing the Freemason white supremacist connection.
Well, I was just using this because the people who are on societies like this, who do things in secret, whose agendas are not quite what they take in a public position like this.
Right. Okay.
This is what I'm just starting to uncover with these. Now some of them are like the Freemasons. They're more syncretic in their beliefs.
Right.
You know, they more pull other others push other people aside.
Right.
But what you find in common are agendas that aren't fully disclosed, either on one or the other. But and the other point that I'm making is that when you would think of that, you would think this would be sort of a fringe activity. Things aren't as fringe. Getting accurate data is always the hard thing. But I can't give you an exact answer on the neo-Nazis and others. But I will tell you that, particularly if you look at the alt-right, just something that caught my eye in writing about some of the major characters of the alt-right, like Milos Yiannopoulos. Yeah. He's one of the darlings that's a popular media figure in this. Who also, I guess, he's a practicing homosexual, right? I think. I'm not saying that against him.
No, but that doesn't seem to jive with the alt-right ethos.
He would declare himself as
the
darling
alt-right loves him, though.
And he's a product of Breitbart. I mean, Steve Bannon was one who really pressed him forward. What I'm getting at is that the religious right has been pulled into their circles of support, even though they're so staunchly anti-homosexual, and obviously he's a practicing homosexual. They are willing, just like when they overlooked Donald Trump's proclivities, the Stormy Daniels types and things. These bedfellows that have gotten together.
I'm so glad Stormy Daniels was mentioned on the 200th episode of Conspiracy.
But what they do is they push aside what they say are their deeply held beliefs, and if they can find some part of darkness and another person matches their own darkness, they find immediate alliance.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What I was getting to on this thing, talking about Steve Bannon and Milos and these other guys and the people who've been funding them. The people who've been funding them are the Bradley family and the other foundations that have been mostly doing the most conservative right wing, as far as like conservative evangelical right wing kind of writing and things like this. And I was just reading about him going to the Cannes Film Festival. Steve Bannon sent Milos there. You know, he's a major firebrand. He gets people stirred up. And he was on the Bradley family yacht in Cannes. And it turns out he was writing the main guy he was hanging out with, it being this really audacious, firebrand that he is. On deck, being interviewed and hanging out, his drink buddy was Robertson from Duck Dynasty. Who, again, would be the darling of the, Value Voter Summit and things like this,
Right.
that, a lot of your Christian films. And I say this as a person of faith. What I'm saying is we're getting into bizarre areas of relationships that you really have to invest the time to start peeling back the onion to find out who's really aligned with who and what's going on. And again, I seem to see whatever darkest elements certain people have, they look for the darkest elements in others, and they set aside whatever their individual noble pursuits were and combined in whatever. It's like the guys who got together to kill Jesus. All of those, whether it was the Romans or the Sanhedrin or whatever, they probably had a few noble activities and things they did, but what drew them together was their darkness of getting rid of a guy that convicted them of their shortcomings.
But it's always been like that on both sides of the spectrum, right? I mean, like you look at Harvey Weinstein, who was a darling of the left for a long time. He had a lot of, an absolute, by all accounts, monster of a human being who was like connected to the highest echelons and espoused the most liberal worldviews, right?
Well, and I think he's getting it's come home to roost,
exactly, yeah.
But I would say his was purely probably fleshly driven. It wasn't ideologically driven per se. I'm worried about people who are ideologically driven that are willing to pit us against each other. It seemed like Weinstein was more concerned about what skirt he was chasing around his desk.
Right.
These are, and I'm not excusing that. All I'm just saying is that I'm worried about people that are willing to bring fire on our heads to prove some kind of point for something that they're doing. So
yeah, that's a good point.
But it's certainly not to excuse that the people that you're mentioning and their behavior.
Let's talk about you guys, all three of you, on this one. I know you all work on this, but Luke, how's your book coming, man?
Well,
it's a book on Stormy Daniels. That's how his eyes perked up over there. You said Stormy Daniels, and I was like,
Are you
talk
waiting
more about Stormy?
Are you waiting for the academic peer review process to be finished for the journals?
Not exactly.
Okay.
I started my book about 2 years ago, and I'm still on the first chapter.
That means because it must be extremely complex.
It is, yeah.
And because of the high standards you have academically, that's why you're having to take the time for research, right?
Yeah.
It would be a little hard for you guys to understand, so I'm not going to try to explain or summarize.
You don't want us to make us feel stupid.
Just wait till it comes out.
So, Randall, first with you, big thing that I'm interested in as it relates to your work is kind of like the role of these secret societies. Is there a knowledge that they are preserving about some of these events that may have happened in the distant past?
Be a little more specific.
Oh, well, okay, the comet impact. The existence of an antediluvian world, for lack of a better term.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a big part of a lot of the...
Before you answer that, I want you to think about something, you and Adam. Realize that the current planets, exoplanets we have found that are nearest our solar system have probably been receiving Conspiranormal for about 3 years. So this has sort of an exoplanet effect. So be careful in your choice of words.
Gotcha.
That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Mike.
I always keep the cosmic factor foremost in my mind when I'm discussing these things, even the most mundane subjects. I try to realize that someday some higher being is going to be tuning in, and
they could be sitting here amongst us. We don't know.
Well, Joe is here, so he's a higher being.
They're listening.
Don't speak directly to him.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry for my foolishness.
I'm still trying to get the gist of his question.
Okay. Remember when we were, I don't know if you remember this or not, but we were in Minneapolis.
Yes.
Where we met you.
Yes.
We were in the Templar Lodge.
Yes, we were, weren't we?
Yep.
What?
And you were showing us this. You were showing us this little. It's like a little tableau that had all these different Freemasonic images on it.
Yes, I did that, didn't I?
And there was one that had a picture. There was a picture of a comet. Or like a star, like a falling star, really.
And at the time that I showed you that,
yeah,
right, and then you vowed that you would never speak of it again. Remember? Did you forget that part?
Yeah.
I think I might have.
What about when you put those compass points up to your chest? You don't remember that? Rode your pant leg?
Yeah.
Do you remember the goat?
I don't remember the goat. No.
No, I think that was after you had already passed out.
Yeah, that's
he only
true.
saw it from behind anyway.
It was that Capricorn rising thing.
That's what
Hey, I got something on this topic about earlier activities. I was just at a birthday party on the way here, which is part of the reason why I was late. And I gave the person who used to be my co-host on Future Quake, I gave him a book, The Complete Works of George Pember. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And this is a topic you may be interested in. He's my favorite theologian ever. Wrote in the mid-19th century. He was about 150 years ahead of his time on everything that he wrote. His most famous book is called Earth's Earliest Ages. He wrote the boldest theories about the geological record. Now, this is a theologian writing, okay, conservative theologian.
A lot of the founders of geology were theologians.
Right.
Yes.
Well, he was responding to the age of Darwinism that was coming and the crisis within the religious community about these records and fossils and what was going on. He was really, in effect, the originator, popularizer of what's called the gap theory. And the gap theory, I don't know if you're familiar with it, is a belief that between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 records a cataclysmic effect that happened in whatever was living on Earth at the time. And there were hints in the Holy Writ that suggested that there were civilizations that were here that were subsequently destroyed. And he posited that possibly some of the fossil records and things were of that earlier civilization, and also some kind of distortion that may have happened because of their league with I hate to say less than stellar forces, accuse the pun, but that there were things that happened that would have justified this record that occurred. But he talked about basically a civilization kill that happened from outside as part of it. So I wasn't sure if you were familiar with that.
Give me the name again.
The book's called Earth's Earliest Ages by George Pember.
George Pember.
G.H. Pember, right?
Okay.
P-E-M-B-E-R, and it's called the gap theory. And this gap theory is not just some flake idea by a handful of people. Some of the most famous theologians, even of the 20th century, who are well known, people don't know they espouse the gap theory. And it actually is one of the only ways to explain some of the most mysterious passages in the Hebrew scriptures. Was in fact, it actually normalizes these stories that there was a pre-existent civilization that was wiped out.
Right.
Just didn't know if that had ever come up in your analysis.
Yes,
possibility.
my reading of Genesis has led me to almost a very similar scenario in that, when I look at, I've tried to go into the original Hebrew to try to really understand, and I'm still learning to understand that language and how the words that were translated in the 1600s out of Hebrew into English, and how they would have been affected by the understanding in the language available at that time. But still, a lot of things come through that suggest there's a whole lot more behind the scenes than what's actually being expressed in the verses, right? What did Yahweh say to Adam? Be fruitful and multiply. Which in the chapter in the book I'm writing now, the last chapter I've been writing, has to do with the scientific evidence for a crash in human population. We were just talking earlier about the disappearance of the Clovis culture.
Right.
And the gap between the Clovis culture and the Folsom culture, which came 600, 800 years later. But in between, you have active cultural sites, you have active quarries, you have radiocarbon dating of the refuge of cultural activity, and then a gap, nothing. And then and right at that gap, at the beginning of that gap, you've got a major spike in oxygen isotope ratios in the Greenland ice cores that shows that there was a major climate shift. These two papers that have just come out that thing you were referencing basically is the documentation that at that same geological horizon precisely, there's a global layer of charcoal that suggests massive firestorms on a huge, huge scale, right? Also at that layer, and you can see this layer like at Blackwater Draw, the original Clovis site. You can see it at Murray Springs. You can see it at a lot of the Clovis sites. There's a layer of material from anywhere from an inch to 4 or 5 inches thick. It's dark because it's loaded with carbon. And it separates the Pleistocene epoch from the Holocene epoch. Pleistocene being characterized by the presence of these gigantic ice sheets over North America and northwestern Europe, characterized by the prevalence of these gigantic megafauna, the woolly rhinos, the giant Irish elk, the dire wolves, the saber-toothed cats, the ground sloths, on and on and on. The sudden disappearance. Now, what drew the attention of investigators to this particular layer that they call the black mat is that below it, you would find Clovis cultural artifacts, but not above it. Below it, you would find the remains of the extinct megafauna, but not above it. The most interesting thing was when, in 2007, when Richard Firestone and his colleagues looked at the base of that black mat layer and discovered nanodiamonds. And since then, these nanodiamonds have been confirmed at multiple sites. And apparently, large swaths of the Earth's surface were just rained upon by billions of these nanodiamonds that now reside at the bottom of that layer, right? So this is a really unique horizon, culturally, geologically, but also it bears the signature of some kind of a cosmic event, right? So you've got this gap there. And so what I've been writing about in this chapter that I'm working on now is we can go much beyond North America, and we can show in northwestern Europe, we can show in Japan, we can show in the Mideast that there were major cultural disruptions that coincided with this. In some cases, the total vacating of large areas, geographic areas, right? Now, getting back to Scripture, getting back to Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. would be the mandate upon survivors of a global catastrophe, where the human population is hovering on the threshold of extinction, just like 120 other megafaunal species, which we are a megafaunal species, right? So be fruitful and multiply. But then think about the next word. Replenish the earth. Replenish the earth. And subdue it. Which is really interesting because what I think that's pointing to is not, here's unlimited license to go out and desecrate nature to any extent you want. It's often been interpreted by critics as giving license, right? Right. I don't think that. I think that it's the recognition that periodically Earth itself is subject to these catastrophic upheavals that completely rearrange the balance of nature. And completely rearrange, remodel the global environment. And that perhaps we humans are the one species out of all of God's species on this planet that could actually intervene in that process. And
in fact, the words that were used for that, the reason man was created was to tend the garden.
To tend the garden, see.
And that's what you're talking about, is tending the garden. And if we would maintain our focus on what we were created to do, this would be a much greater garden.
Well, this is why I think that ultimately, I think life on this planet came from out there. We could get into the idea of, you can talk about God and the Creator, and it can be a totally supernatural phenomena that's completely outside human consciousness or comprehension, I'll say, or human understanding. Or we could realize we're endowed with brains and the reasoning power by our Creator that will allow us to scientifically understand, at least on some level, the process by which life came to this planet and by which life has evolved. See, for me, creationism, creation account, evolution, I don't see those as contradictory because I see evolution as being a divinely guided process. So in that context, I don't see a conflict between those two particular views.
Sure.
But on the other hand, if we look at what I've seen now is that life has been struggling on this planet. It's almost like the idea of the garden. Earth is a cosmic garden, but it keeps getting invaded and it keeps getting catastrophically destroyed, and the whole program gets reset. And at some point, it's like, I look at that like the curse, the curse that came upon the earth with the spilling of the blood that replayed itself during the flood of Noah. So you had the spilling of the blood with the slaying of Abel by Cain. You had the spilling of the waters that destroyed life on earth, which I think now has a geological reality to it, that we can actually say, yes, there were great floods. Yeah. Now, not necessarily a flood that drowns the whole earth to the top of Mount Everest, but floods that were on such a scale that they would wipe out the world as people would know it at the time. Right. So in the aftermath of some of these events, survivors of one of these gigantic mega floods that I've been studying and researching in the field now for 25 years, is that if you were lucky enough to survive, you could look around you and everything that you knew is gone. And you don't know who else has survived. You have no way of communicating with anybody who may have survived 500 or 1,000 miles away. So as far as you know, the world is destroyed and you're starting over. But at some point, I think that it's the mandate of the divine intelligence of life, terrestrial life, and whatever its source, that it wants to transcend this cyclical curse of destructions and repetitions. And we humans could very well be the agency by which the mandates of nature achieve that goal.
Well, I would believe from a traditional Christian or even Judeo-Christian viewpoint of those scriptures you're pointing out, what you have said is completely orthodox. And in fact, I would say you could see that the only... to me, the only critical part of that creation story you're talking about, like what's not sacred of the traditional view that we hang to, is that the clear message to be derived from it was that man had a special purpose. It was not an accident, a material accident. It was created without meaning. The only part of that we need to be literalistic about is that man had a purpose, and it was not because he was superior because of the role he had in creation, was that his duties were higher than everything else in creation. The duty was to be the caretaker of the creation, and it is a heavy duty and crown to wear to do that. And it's clear in there, in fact, when you take the story at its face value, the first prophecy that's in Scripture, where it talks about after the fall and God comes and approaches the serpent and the woman, that first prophecy, called the Proto-Evangelion, it is a clear saying that mankind will prevail. It will crush the head of the serpent that tries to destroy, not because of mankind's power, but because of what mankind was created to do. The rest of the story of the narrative is an affirmative of that, and that the garden will be restored, but it'll be a super garden that's restored.
And see, when you say the serpent, of course, brings to my mind the universality, the ubiquity of the serpent motif in so many traditions. And when you say crush the head of the serpent, one of the things that I see is that's a literal metaphor for the serpent is repeatedly the comets. Mm-hmm. Repeatedly, you see traditions depicting comets as serpents in the sky. Even to the point where you see medieval manuscripts, cometa, in Latin, and you've got this dragon up there titled the Latin for comet, right?
But the last book of the Bible, which is the Apocalypse, to wrap it all up, is a story of things coming from the sky,
absolutely,
leading to man's demise, where it says their hearts fail them for fear of what they see coming on the earth.
But also the dichotomy of the serpent being a force to be feared in terms of being venomous and a force of knowledge in a lot of global cultures can be sort of seen if you look at the serpent as an asteroid or extraterrestrial body impacting Earth, can be seen as that sort of like life giver, life knowledge bringer, life destroyer sort of dichotomy. I would think, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an ambiguity to that whole symbol of the serpent.
Well, I think the message there is knowledge without wisdom is dangerous.
I like that.
Man has a natural curiosity from his very first man to each of us here. What we're expressing is a curiosity about knowledge. Yeah. We all would like to know where we want to stick our nose and stuff beyond what we're reading in the newspapers. And if we don't have wisdom hand in hand with us, it's like walking down a blind alley because we're just curious what's down at the end of it.
Knowledge without wisdom is at least 15 to 30, maybe 15 to like 45. You know,
you get a little license, you mean, and the age for that. Yeah. Wisdom has to catch up a little bit.
All right.
I was thinking about 15 to 65.
Maybe.
Let's do this. It's about 7:30, so I'm going to turn it over for anybody that wants to ask questions. We got to get that mic over there. So let's do about 30, 35 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to start with Joshua. As far as the cryptozoological stuff, I wanted to ask you, because I hadn't found any information yet where you were talking about this, but what do you think the role or implications of some of these, I guess you'd call them imitative cults that are in some of these traditional societies, like to the berserkers in the Norse, Germanic stuff, where they take on these roles of these cryptozoological creatures, or the skinwalkers and the Dene people in the Southwest? What's your take on some of that and how it relates?
It's a really good question. To me, like, I have just enough of a sort of, anomalist in me to think that there's something to these stories, but just enough of a skeptic to think that there's not a literal transformation. If you look at, sort of like something that pops immediately into mind is like the idea that like Amazonian shamans would take on ayahuasca and would sort of become the jaguar or could become the jaguar at will. I don't think that literally means that they actually transformed into a jaguar. I think that it's part and parcel with what you see in a lot of shamanic cultures. Some cultures use this to the tribes. Well, they would all use it to the tribe's benefit, but some would use it for destructive or productive processes. I would imagine that the berserker thing the berserker thing might be literally just completely entirely rooted in like or a hallucinogenic frenzy, like a frenzied sort of thing. When I think about like the more peaceful applications of that, I think that it possibly has a lot more to do with like, where are the herds going? Where should we hunt? You know, do we have permission from certain spirits of the land to interface with that sort of thing? The idea of an actual like physical transformation is a bridge too far for me, you know. But I don't think that the idea that certain consciousnesses could interact is out of the question. So I would wonder, you know, there's this great, like, some people talk about what separates, you know, an anomalist from a Fortean. And there's this great story that was related back in, I believe it was like the 70s or 80s, where there was like a cat, and I'm probably butchering the story, but there was a cat that like was in a crowd and turned around and said, "Look at that," and walked away. A Fortean will find that interesting. You know, someone who is interested in like the weird sciencey thing will not find that interesting, but the Fortean will find that interesting because of what it says about culture, about what it says about, you know, about what it says about the way that we interpret weird things. I think that a lot of the stuff that we find in terms of these sort of like transformative cults, might have a lot more, might sit in that sort of space. It might be a lot more about like, this is just sort of a stranger thing that happens that might have some relevance on the way that we perceive the world, but might not. That's not entirely eloquent.
As far as kind of like a chicken and the egg thing.
Yeah, I mean,
some of this stuff is coming from what people were actually doing first, and a lot of the lore is coming from things that maybe people are initiating or people are trying to emulate creatures they actually saw.
Well, I think it's sort of co-creative too at that point. You know, I mean, like, so how much of it is the fact that the berserker is wearing the skin of a bear and has, you know, bear claw, brass knuckles, for lack of a better term, and how much of it is the fact that you are aware that there's going to be a berserker coming for you wearing all that, and you know, where does that line sort of blur? I do think that there is a blending of that there is a blending of consciousnesses, and that's an entirely possible scenario. Because, you know, if you look at, like, so again, coming back to, like, so the were-jaguar cults, you'll find that people who have no experience in the Amazon jungle will take something like ayahuasca, which is closely associated with, you know, the Banisteriopsis caapi and the vine, and the fact that, you know, jaguars will actually, like, consume that vine, in addition with the other leaf that actually acts as an MAO inhibitor. You'll find that people that take that particular brew in certain settings will actually experience visions of jaguars. Will actually experience those. You know, I think there was a study that was done that actually they gave ayahuasca to Inuits who still experience visions of spotted cats.
Really?
Despite the fact that they had never been, you know, never even seen a spotted cat. Yeah.
Have you done any? I hadn't found any information where you did any research on like the Southwestern American stuff as far as like the skinwalkers and those types of.
That's a little bit of a blind spot for me, you know. Part of it, honestly, like, you know, I'm a little bit of a chicken shit about that. Because, you know, it's the skinwalker mythos is so sort of
scary. I'm from Arizona.
So it's intimidating. You know, it's very intimidating. But I think that there is sort of a. I think that there's sort of a that threads a line between reality and this sort of alternate reality that touches upon a lot of the things we talked about. You know, there's not a strong tradition of like where things in Celtic lore, which is sort of my speciality. But at the same time, I feel like there is a certain mouthfeel of realism to a lot of those Skinwalker stories that I completely buy into. The danger is that you just assume that it's an old culture, so therefore it must be true. Mm-hmm. Which you sort of got to sort of do a gut check and be aware of that. But I think that the act of engaging with things on that sort of spiritual level might possibly open a fissure for larger or more dramatic events to happen. A la the stuff at the Sherman Ranch, which is, yeah.
Cool. That was real good. I got and for Randall Carlson, I was reading and hearing some interviews where you were talking about kind of going back to same chicken and egg kind of thing like you guys referenced earlier. Are some of these places embedded with power, therefore people begin to build things on them, or is the process of humans building these things and doing these certain things at these places, creating power in these places? But I had also heard you talking about possible ancient technology that's forgotten as to... I wanted to ask if you had any kind of speculation that you'd like to share as to what exactly some of this technology might be of these temples, of these sacred mounds, things like this, what they actually might have hoped to accomplish, or any speculation.
Well, if I had to come down on any side of it, I would say that the special properties were intrinsic, that they were there. Early, very sensitive humans could have detected that there's a special quality, a special energy about certain places. And I think that science is moving in the direction of being able to objectify that and demonstrate that there is actually measurable and quantifiable differences in the energy fields that we're constantly surrounded by. But, the work I did 5 or 6 years ago, I don't even remember on which podcast I was a guest along with Paul Devereaux, who has done a lot of research, geomantic research around the British Isles, and looking at the geological component of the siting of a lot of the ancient stone and megalithic structures, and discovered that they were clustered along fault lines. And was that you that said, no, somebody talking about the Oracle of Delphi?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. The Oracle of Delphi being at the intersection of two of the largest fault lines in the Greek peninsula. And so the idea that there could be some natural forces that could alter human consciousness in some effect.
Well, that's the fumes, supposedly, that they would waft up. They would hold
the fumes emanating from
the crevasse. Right.
And there could be multiple agents at work here. One that was mentioned, a lot of research going back as early as this, was that the hippocampus region of the brain can be actually affected by changes in the geomagnetic field, ionization of the atmosphere that can occur under intense stresses that are set up in the Earth's crust. And when an earthquake happens, what you have is a sudden release of stress that is built up on a fault line. But in things like luminosities in the atmosphere, people hearing booming sounds, things like this prior to, and sometimes even after an earthquake, the fact that animals are somehow sensing that something is about to happen. The idea here, I think, is that you also have stresses that are constantly accumulating and dissipating in the crust of the Earth, oftentimes without breaking the fault, and so it's like we live on the surface of this immense ball of material here, this little thin rocky crust over this huge molten material, and there are tremendous forces at play. And I think particularly earlier humans who lived in nature all their life were probably, undoubtedly, more sensitive to these forces. I became convinced of the reality of force fields back in, I think it was 1975. I was building a pole barn along the Chattahoochee River in Georgia, and I designed the barn. The owner of the property said, well, he had access to telephone poles and could I use those somehow to build him a barn, right? So he had 15 of them. So what I did was I plotted out 3 rows of 5 each, right? And they were maybe 25 feet apart and maybe 40 feet long, the 3 rows, right? I then called up Ma Bell, the phone company in Georgia, and inquired as to how much it would cost to get their driver out with an auger truck to dig the holes and set the poles for me. And they said, well, $15 a pole. And I said, let's do it. All right. So a few days later, I have in the ground there I've cleared off and leveled, I have stakes. I've driven every place I want a pole to be set. And these are basically refurbished or reconstituted telephone poles, right? The truck pulls up. There's a driver. There's actually 2 guys in the front seat of the truck with this big auger truck. And then there's a back door on it. And they pull up. And the 2 guys that are in the Ma Bell uniforms, this fella gets out of the back seat. And he's a tall, skinny guy. He must have been 6'5", 6'6", an old crumpled hat, overalls, yeah, because he had the straps, really almost like a stereotypical type of character. And he's carrying something that looked like a violin case. And he gets out, and he comes walking down, and he opens it up, and he takes out
Dowsing rods.
Mm-hmm. So he's got these dowsing rods, and really all they are is the old-fashioned telescoping automobile antennas with the ball at the end.
It's about the user more than the actual.
I think so, yeah. So he gets those out, and he goes with them. And my first reaction was this: I'd heard of water witching, but I didn't know anything about it, really, other than I'd certainly never seen anybody in action, a dowser. So my first reaction was, wait a minute, these guys are pulling my leg. But so he goes walking over each of the stakes. And as he walks over, his rods are just kind of like this, He'd go over each one, and then as he passed over it, he would shout up to the guys in the truck, clear, and he did that, all 15 of them, right? So now, where I was going to build the barn and where the house was, the road that came into the property was there. The water line, the water main that came in from the road, the gravel road out at the edge of the property, came in under the driveway, right? He goes walking, and he walks across the driveway, and I knew vaguely that it was under the driveway, but I didn't know exactly where. He walks over, and I'm watching him this whole time. I'm still like, I guess this is for real, right? He gets over this spot, and I swear it was like somebody grabbed the ends of these things, pulled them into an X, and they were actually bending like this.
Wow.
And then he stepped over, and as he stepped across, they relaxed and went back to this like this. And then what he did is he walked in a zigzag pattern, and he was able to trace out exactly where the water line goes. And the owner came out and goes, yeah, that's where it is. So, and I'm standing there watching this whole time. I've been overworking. I'm building, while I'm waiting for them to do this, I was overbuilding a garage, right? So this whole time I'm standing there, probably just holding my hammer in my hand, watching this. And he looks at me and goes, you want to try it?
Well, and what you described is not explicable by like user malfunction. Right. Like if it's actually like bending like that close,
it was almost like shocking. It's not. But I kind of sheepishly and self-consciously said, sure.
Right.
I took them like, these guys are watching me, and okay. And I stepped across, and it was like I got an electric shock. And I could feel, it felt like somebody grabbed the ends of those rods and were holding them. And then I stepped across, and I was able to do it. And I've tried many times since then, and I've gotten a mild response, but never anything near that first time. And it might have been, I don't know, I've often thought, well, was it his presence there? Was it because I was in a state of mind of complete innocence, not expecting anything or projecting anything, that I had such that strong response? But after that, I became convinced. And then, of course, I had a lot of friends of mine that served in Vietnam, because I'm of that generation. And I had one friend of mine who was in the Marines who told me that they used dowsers over there to find mines. And I thought, well, now, if they're doing that and they're actually finding mines, there's got to be something to it, because, if it's just, random, 50% chance or whatever, just random statistic chance, but it's a matter of life and death.
You'd run out of people to do it if it was just random. Yeah.
Right. So,
well, and millionaires don't believe in astrology or woo. Billionaires do. It's the people in power actually acknowledge the power of this stuff.
Which is a shame why they don't have long antennas like that on the front of Humvees to catch IEDs before they drive over them. They could see them cross in front of them.
But to get back to your question, I think that Paul Devereaux was onto something, that he saw that they were placing these megalithic structures and correlating them with fault lines. The work of what was his name again?
Persinger.
Yeah. And I forget what was his partner that wrote the book. Space-Time Transients and Unusual Events. Mm-hmm. They wrote it in the 70s, and it was a statistical analysis of all of these strange, anomalous Fortean-type events. And they plotted them on a map of North America, and then showed that there was a correlation between the underlying geological structures and these events. For example, there was a huge concentration of events in southern Illinois, which is right there associated with the fault, right. The New Madrid fault zone, right? So it was these kind of correlations. And then shortly after that's when I discovered the work of Paul Devereaux, and he was basically coming up with the idea that many of this ancient sites in Britain. Then I came across the work of Guy Underwood, who wrote the book called The Pattern of the Past, and he was a geomancer, dowser, who spent years studying the placing of sacred sites in Europe that could have ranged anywhere from a megalithic stone up to a cathedral. And one of the things that he reported was, and to the extent I've been able to find geological confirmation, he was right, showing that under all of the major cathedrals, there is a crossing of underground streams. And then, which brings us back to the conversation we were having today with some of the fringe work of people like Wilhelm Reich, who was working with his orgone energy and discovering that certain means they were able to concentrate the orgone energy using accumulators. He was able to control it and manipulate it by means of his cloudbusters, he called them, all which worked, by the way, only when they were grounded into flowing water. That was the key to making them work. If you set up an orgone accumulator and you didn't have it grounded, and he used a heavy BX cable leading off of the end of his cloudbuster that led into, he would put it into a deep well or put it into a river, and then it would work. And if it wasn't into the water, it was like the circuit didn't close, right? So he discovered that he could actually manipulate the weather using that and change wind directions and atmospheric patterns and pressure. And I think that very possibly, then when you look at the structure of his orgone accumulators, the layering effect was what he claimed was responsible for this concentration, even to the point where looking through a lens into the thing, you could see many people saw this. You could look in and there would be like a blue light inside the accumulators. Well, when you look at the structures of the ancient monumental earthworks, they're exactly that. They're revetted layers of organic and inorganic material. They're placed above or adjacent to flowing water. To me, all of that is highly suggestive that they were somehow manipulating or controlling. And I think that the question you asked is that the energy was there, that the unique property or quality was there. The structures served as amplifying systems, ways of instruments, amplifying instruments that could concentrate. And I think that's the whole basis of the Hermetic art, the alchemical science, which is the fusion of that which is above, which that is below. And I think that's ultimately the basis of early Christianity about this linking of heaven and earth.
In addition to some consciousness change as well.
Oh, of course, that goes right along with it.
And you'll find this amplification motif in a lot of other structures, like certain structures that are designed to be acoustically amplified, where a whisper will turn into, or certain frequencies, often with, in Paul Devereaux's work, the male voice register will actually resonate with the structure in a certain way that actually has possibly a consciousness, altering effect.
Mm-hmm. You see, the sacred structures are always built with sacred geometry. So what that means is that, like, one of the interesting things is when you look at the Gothic cathedrals that were built between about 1130 and about 1300, during that amazing period, that epoch of these building these grand monuments, they are repositories of sacred geometry, of astronomy, of symbolism. They're very universal in their preservation of knowledge. But when you go in there, you realize that they're all built according, each cathedral is built according to its own module, right? So each cathedral, the master builder would have his measuring stick, all right, his cubit stick that was the basis, and everything was generated from that, right? As it turns out, the yardstick for each cathedral is adjusted according to its position on the surface of the earth. Because as you move north or south, your distance from the center of mass of the earth changes, the curvature of the earth changes, the lines of latitude and longitude shift.
The earth is flat, so Randall, that's not.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
That's
I
been
get it.
determined.
So 40 years of research is just it's down the toilet. Okay.
That's what the rapper B.O.B. told me.
Never mind.
Told me that.
The earth is flat.
But saying it was round, how would you continue?
Okay. Well, that's the idea. The idea I'm getting at is there was a standard, a module of each cathedral, and it was linked to its latitude on the earth, which I've gone into pretty much 5 or 6 cathedrals analyzing the data from architectural analysis and dimensional analysis and being able to show that. Then at the same time, they're also like at Chartres Cathedral. It's built over the confluence of underground water. And if you go down into the crypt under Chartres, there's a deep well, and you go to the bottom of the well, and it's right into the water table. And the interesting thing is when you're standing on the paving floor in the nave of the cathedral, the water table, the depth of the water table, which does fluctuate a little bit, but overall the depth of the water table is the same distance below the floor as the height of the ogival vault is above the floor. And when you look at the pillars that go up into the ogive, and the ogive, you have to understand, is a very remarkable structural innovation in that I don't have anything here. I wish I had what's this right here? Okay. I don't know.
Chopstick?
Yeah.
Is that incense?
I don't know. It's just a little piece of wood. Okay. So usually if I demonstrate this, I would get like a wooden rule or something. But basically, here's the idea. Up until the invention of the Gothic vault, virtually all structural forces were compressive. So if you look at typical Romanesque architecture, going back to Greek architecture to Egyptian, they all relied on big, heavy, squat, very compressive structural elements. When you get to the Gothic cathedral and the vault, what happens is you've got the pillars coming up, and the pillars are truncated at various stages which are harmonically related according to certain geometric square root of 2, square root of 3, which are these harmonic numbers. And then you get to the vault itself. The mortar that they used was as stronger than the stone they used. So when they laid up, the carpenters would come in and they would build this incredible formwork of timber, and then the masons would come in and lay up the stonework, right? After it had set up, the master builder would go and stand under the false work or the scaffolding work when they took it out to show his confidence that the vault, which is thousands of tons of stone, 150, 180 feet up in the air, right? That his confidence is not going to collapse on him and crush him. But here's the thing. When you look at it, you realize that the stone of the vault acts as a single element, right? And whereas most architectural forces up till that time have been purely compressive, right? Want to shorten the fibers of a material. The stones in Gothic vault are under tension, right? So it's almost like they're bent like this. And if you know what a flying buttress is, the flying buttress comes in from the side and holds the stresses in laterally, because if you were to instantly remove the flying buttress, the vault would do this. It would spring up. That's what it wants to do. And so what they've done is they've created a structural system that is almost like an instrument that's been tuned. And they've created this harmonically shaped and sized vault where all of these forces can be amplified. So I think the answer to your question is...
I think what you are resembling there is a tuning fork.
A tuning fork. Thank you. Yes. Thanks. Perfect. Perfect analogy. Yes. A tuning fork. And each cathedral will vibrate at a slightly different tune. And that tune has now been harmonically correlated with its position on the earth. And what Guy Underwood discovered and documented in Pattern of the Past is all these cathedrals are linked by this network of underground flowing water. And what was even further interesting to me is that one of the things that Louis Charpentier, who was a French researcher who wrote on Chartres Cathedral, he showed how all of the Notre Dame cathedrals that are dedicated to the Virgin, right? If you actually plot them out on the landscape, and it's Notre Dame, it's St. Denis, it's Chartres, it's Léon, it's Reims, it's Amiens. There's 8 of them, if I remember right. If you plot them out, it creates almost a perfect effigy of the constellation of the Virgin, nice. Virgo. Now, that to me raises some really, really interesting questions, because on the one hand, an astronomer can look at some of these ancient structures and say, oh, the basis for designing these things was astronomical. But now a geologist can look at them and go, oh, well, the basis of these structures was geological, or the basis of this was the pattern of energy in the landscape. Well, I think it was all of these things. But here's the thing. If each of those cathedrals is placed on a location, a naturally occurring location, where there are underground springs or confluence of underground watercourses, right? And those particular sites, if they pre-existed the cathedrals, they were geological phenomena imprinted in the landscape, they're already there duplicating the constellation of Virgo in the geology of Europe. And
I think if just in my engineer background, what I assume, this is probably obvious to everybody else, but what I'm thinking the moving water would do in a pure physical sense, I'm not talking about supernatural, but physical, is it creates electromagnetic field. Mm-hmm. You basically made a coil. And that's what moving water will do. It'll create a field like that. And so when you make a coil, you're going to induce forces in a field that would even affect other people.
Well, I know that when I went to Lourdes, and you probably know the story somewhat of Lourdes, right? And the vision of Bernadette Subaru, and how the miracle there was that she had this vision of this, woman in white and all of this, the Queen of Heaven there in the grotto, where the town of Lourdes was using as a garbage dump. And she was told, there was a series of visitations, and each time there was a visitation, her followers would grow and she would come back with these messages and gave to the local bishop, and eventually he wanted to test this divine woman. So he said, see if you can make this particular type of rose bloom this month, which was out of season. And so she goes, but what happens is that the divine presence then tells her to eat the plants and dig in the dirt, right? Which she does. And then everybody thinks she's nuts, right? Well, then shortly after everybody's abandoned the site, gone home and left it, what happens is a spring bubbles out of that spot. And I've seen that spring, and it is a copious spring. So it's like something was going on there. It's like that was what Guy Underwood referred to as a blind spring, would be a spring that has not actually broken the surface, but is nonetheless rising under pressure, perhaps artesian pressure. And just the presence of that underground water rising under pressure could cause changes in the ambient field that could be detected by a sensitive individual. So it's probable then that spring obviously was there. But whatever brought this about, the divine visitation, the message to dig, and then the fact that an actual spring did emerge from that spot, that exact spot, is really quite remarkable. And it's been thoroughly documented. But I got to say, when I was there, I felt something very powerful. And I don't know how to really put my finger on what it was, but it was right up there with some of the peak experiences of my life, that there was this sense. I don't know how to describe it, but it was a very potent experience. And they've now built an abbey over the grotto. And going in there, I mean, I couldn't, this feeling was just this palpable feeling where you just basically felt like just weeping because it was so intense. And people, I was watching people come into the sanctuary there, and they would walk in, and within about 30 seconds they would be crying. And it wasn't, I don't think, just emotional. I think it was something really visceral and physical. There was a sense that something was happening to your nervous system that was affecting you emotionally.
Well, I mean, almost without exception, a lot of apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary have appeared near or at springs.
Yeah.
And they coincide with a lot of like sort of like again, my interest area, nymphs or sylphs or these sort of like, water elemental spirits sort of areas. But you were talking about like sort of the outlay of cathedrals mirroring celestial events, and it reminds me of what I think was Robert Bivall described the Giza Plateau as being a mirror of heaven.
Yes,
of Orion.
Right, exactly. It's reflective of what's happening in the stars, and that sort of really reminded me of that. But again, like this idea of the water, I think that, again, something we talked about in our conversation, which I wish I'd recorded. I wish you could have all been flies on the window of my car today. There is a strong correlation between something to do with water and the supernatural. Not to get this is in the more woo category, which I guess I specialize in. But if you look at a lot of people who talk about anomalous Fortean things, they tend to happen near water. UFO sightings are more prevalent near water. Bigfoot sightings are more prevalent in river basins or near bodies of running water. A lot of people will talk about hauntings being more common near underground springs. And something that I sort of thought about today earlier is like we realize that there is a biological need for water. In other words, life can't be supported as we know it without water. But what if there's a metaphysical reason for water producing life or producing phenomena? What if that's something that isn't equally important?
Well, if I could just mention on from a ancient writing scriptural standpoint, there's a connection between water, people, and visitations from above. And one case in point is in Revelation chapter 8 when it talks about wormwood, a celestial coming down. I did a presentation on this that you've seen about Revelation 8 and actually really looking at what the Greek words are. The word is actually Artemis. There. It is actually a name for Diana that's being called out, or also Hecate, who actually has keys.
Paging Walter Bosley.
That actually come down, and it says it comes down on the waters, the hydros, and makes them bitter. And the actual waters used in the very next chapter talks about the waters represent people and nations and communities, and it talks about making them, the word for bitter also mean enraged. And the picture is just like when you see with the Dionysus worshippers, they would actually have a visitation, and they would basically, like the Menaids, would be taken over and go crazy, and a third of the people die. But what it appears they're calling down is what we know was Artemis or Diana, calling her down from the sky. Visitation of a woman from the sky. It comes on the waters as a metaphor for people, and there's a transformative effect that happens as a liminal goddess. But on a more recent situation, when you're talking about ley lines or these other sacred geometry, when I got a few years ago the original letters of R.C. Christian, and was able to go in the vault that built the Georgia Guidestones, and actually have them in my possession, his original letters. His designation of them was to build them on these particular ley lines, that the whole Georgia Guidestone monolith, which was meant to represent the ancient structures with all the astrological alignments and astronomical and things like that. But they were designed to be on what the Cherokees called the navel of the world, is where it was, and they ended up having to move it slightly, but then they had to fit it within other ley line geometries because of the requirements of being able to build it and the people who provided it. But that was a key point that they had to find to harness that energy for whatever purpose.
Neomphalos, the navel of the world.
Is there a question for Dr. Future as well?
No, I was just trying to tie that in. I think it was good you all got to riff off each other like that. I just wanted to add really quick, too, we were talking about survival of these cataclysmic events that may be coming and strategies and what people may have tried to do in the past. I wanted to know what you all thought about the role of the mythology of the underworld and the role of caves and caverns in, old religions, into the mystery schools, etc. Maybe these are some kind of remembrance of people hiding out underground to survive these cataclysmic events.
Nice. Good question.
Well, I think I can address that because, like this new research that's coming out, that the article that Adam quoted from.
Yes.
So there's these two exhaustive papers, which, by the way, I was going to print a couple of copies and bring them with of the original papers that have just been published in Journal of Geology, basically documenting that there was this massive firestorms that associated with the termination of the Ice Age. Clearly, surviving a massive firestorm could be enhanced by going underground, no doubt. No doubt. And a lot of the origination mythology talks about
and it
the
would have been
emergence.
Instinctive. You wouldn't have had to have a lot of education to realize something's hitting on my head. I better go down this hole.
Well, just think about what we've done in our own modern times in terms of trying to come up with a strategy for surviving a nuclear war. Bunkers, underground bunkers, right? Cheyenne Mountain. So the kind of event that we would be talking about, like a Tunguska type event, which basically sets fire to the atmosphere. In the Tunguska event, it was 800 and some square miles, which is about the size of any large metropolitan city in America. So, and one of the co-authors, William Napier, who actually wrote a very astute letter to the Cosmic Tusk after the last interview I did with Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock. He was a member of he's a British astronomer who is the member of the Comet Research Group. And we had Malcolm LeCompte on there, who is also a member. And I had the opportunity of participating in this roundtable discussion with about 5 of these guys that were co-authors of that paper. So I had 3 days of where I was able to just basic up everything that they were doing. And at this time, they were engaged in writing the papers, which have now, they're not published in hard copy yet. They're only available online if you're subscribed to Journal of Geology or you have an academic connection with it. But yeah, so what this is showing is that you may have had, and this is where I'm getting at with William Napier's work, along with Victor Klube, they are referred to themselves as have been referred to as neo-catastrophists. And their work goes back to the early 80s. In fact, the first book that they wrote that I read by them was called The Cosmic Serpent, in which they analyzed all of these ancient myths regarding serpents and dragons and stuff, and showed the strong correlation between myths of serpents and dragons and cosmic phenomena, right? So William Napier wrote this very laudatory letter to the Cosmic Tusk in the wake of this interview that we did, because that interview has had somewhere between 5 and 7 million views. So even the guys working in the Comet Research Group acknowledged that interview that we did on Rogan was probably the greatest publicity that this idea has ever had, right? So William Napier, he wrote a very laudable letter, and you could go onto the Cosmic Tusk, you can read it, but he is the originator of this idea that we may encounter swarms of Tunguska-like events, of Tunguska-like debris, maybe even to the point where you could be talking hundreds or thousands in a swarm from a recently disaggregated cometary nucleus. And what this would mean is the key thing to understand about Tunguska is it didn't hit the ground. It blew up in the atmosphere, see? And then it set the atmosphere on fire that was able to consume completely to ashes about 250 square miles of forest, and then completely flattened because of the pressure wave that went out from the blast, completely flattened about 600 more square miles of this old-growth taiga forest. So, in the event of that kind of a phenomena, going underground would be a good survival strategy.
And to sort of piggyback off that idea, my particular reference to this is failing because Soraya Azkath is not fulfilling his Who Wants to Be a Millionaire Phone a Friend capacity right now. But in a book by Robert Schock, there is a reference to artwork that has been recorded in certain caves of plasma phenomena, and all the plasma phenomena depicted in that certain artwork seems to be the sort of plasma phenomena that you could watch while not being lethal. And the plasma phenomena that is not depicted in that artwork is the sort of plasma phenomena that would kill you. So it's there's an interesting sort of correlation there.
So they didn't make pictographs after they'd been killed. Is what you're saying.
Yeah, basically. Wow.
Yeah. Shouldn't we talk about Adam since he's gone right now for the minute? Anybody want to give what you really?
Oh
feel
my
about
God, that guy!
Adam,
the guy.
He'll never hear it. So you might as well say
this
it
elaborate
now.
ruse but this conspiranormal ruse that we've been putting on.
Well, I've got some initial impressions that I could share with everybody, but
well, I'd like to do it in song. Ding dong, the witch is dead, the witch is dead, wicked witch is dead. Oh, I'm sorry.
But I think that there's something to that. I mean, I think that it's very telling that a lot of these Neolithic structures that you find in the British Isles contain souterrains, which are either, depending on their interpretation, either storage areas or passageways between certain settlements where they could completely traverse underground. I don't know if that has any sort of direct correlation between sort of larger cataclysmic events or not, but I think that it speaks to the fact that we had an affinity for being underground that we don't possess nowadays.
Well, I've often thought, having visited some of the caves in Europe, that, somebody spent a lot of time here, a lot of time on their hands, and I'm thinking, now, were they killing time while seeking refuge from some type of event? So, hey,
can't go outside, so let's get our light brights out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I want to say, how much longer are we going to go? Are we... That's up to the missing Adam.
I think Adam had said we'd be finishing nowish.
Hey, but by the way, when Pompeii happened, do you see a lot of sign that their society went in any kind of pre-designed caves or any kind of thing like that in an attempt to get away?
I don't know. I haven't looked into that.
Because, I hate to go back to Revelation again, but that's one of the key things in that book was that when they see the cataclysm of the sixth seal open coming down onto the earth, their immediate response was to get under the rocks to protect themselves. For what's coming down onto the earth. And that's basically what you're looking. You're looking for shelter. Even the kings of the earth and all the other, and both the rich and poor agreed because they knew what was coming onto the earth and they were trying to. So that was in ancient literature. You know, you were talking about these overall structures in the water and things like this. I'm very curious to see what's going to come out with these new discoveries under the Great Pyramid that were just announced recently, and they haven't fully. I don't think they've disclosed it all yet, have they? About
not that I know of.
About they found new passageways and some new things even under. Not only new things that relate to like some throne around the king's chamber, but also something underneath the pyramid. And I know that didn't the Nile used to go past those structures of the Great Pyramid before nature and
there was a
cataclysmic
time
diverted it?
Interestingly, there was a time early in the Holocene, late Pleistocene, between 11 and 12,000 years ago, when the Nile was undergoing super floods.
Yeah.
That brought it right up.
I mean, there's salt. There's actually salt on the side of the flood. I mean, of the pyramids. There's salt on it. So there had to be water that got in there. So you would have had moving water like you were talking about.
The Sphinx, clearly to me, the Sphinx was submerged by flowing water.
Right.
You know, I accepted that for years. And then when I spent the day there myself investigating it after I'd studied rock erosion for a decade, I came away convinced, there's no other explanation. The Sphinx was submerged under flowing water.
You show a picture of that structure, just a sort of a sample of that structure, out of context to people who study weather erosion, and they'll come to the same conclusion.
Oh, yeah. And I've done that.
Yeah.
I want to say, anybody who's eventually is listening to this, 2 websites, Geocosmic Rex and Sacred Geometry International, where I've got a lot of this material. Geocosmic Rex, there's lots of really great video clips and images and drone footage of a lot of these landscapes. It's put up by my friend Brad Young, who has been my traveling buddy for about 20 years now. And we've been documenting this stuff, and he's putting up some of this really, really rich stuff. We've got some of the best drone. In fact, the drone footage that he's been taking of these on these trips now is of such a caliber that National Geographic bought our drone footage of the Camas Prairie ripple train and included that in their last documentary that came out within the last year on the mega floods. So if you see that National Geographic documentary on the mega floods, there's drone footage that my friend Brad took when we were out there at the Camas Prairie. Have you got it there? Is that what you're pointing at? Oh, I thought you were pointing.
No, Luke is pointing at Stormy Blaze. What's her name?
Stormy Daniels.
Stormy Daniels.
So anyway, Geocosmic Rex is where I have a lot of the geological stuff, and then on the sacred geometry, I have a lot of stuff addressing like your questions and the idea of I've got several articles up there on the Holy Grail and the symbolism of the Grail and how it may actually be an indication of a technology for replenishing the earth post-catastrophe.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah.
Josh.
Just the moment my wife calls. Hello?
Oh, now the higher power.
That's right. Right.
Just when the phone started ringing, Adam said, well, I think it's time to...
I think that's a good place to leave it.
This is a good place to stop.
Tell her thank you for letting us borrow you.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't get home, it'll be your cataclysm.
No. So, to what do I owe this call? Am I in trouble?
Josh, give your website.
And yeah, we're done. I think we're about finished up.
Yeah, we're about finished
the podcast, and now we're gonna eat pizza. And
you should put her on speaker, Randall, so everybody can hear her, like I did the Luke earlier.
What? Yes. We have Adam has reserved a real nice hotel room for us.
But he has to sleep with me, so I'm not sleeping naked.
Yeah.
So sleep with this asshole you spent 4 hours with already.
You just spend all day and all night, most of the day tomorrow with Joshua.
We're going to do a little sightseeing around Nashville tomorrow, and then stop. What was the site?
Old Stone Fort.
What is it on the way back?
Stone Fort.
Old Stone Fort. We're going to probably hit a site on the way back.
That and some Nashville hot chicken, we're good.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Is there hot chicken between here and...
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Julie. Bye-bye.
Give me the hot chicken. Okay,
I just so happen to have a trophy for cooking hot chicken.
yeah, what the fuck, man? You show up late and you don't bring any goddamn magical fries.
Rob
You're the
has,
fry
Rob
king.
has to mark it. Rob has to mark
Yeah,
it.
well, I know you guys at the end of the show,
Well,
so
you know,
I'm unleashing, man. Luke,
You're welcome for those Weizen stuff on knockoff.
I am
beers you've
done
been
with your
drinking.
shit, man, because like you showed up late, dude, and like no fucking fries, no Chick-fil-A. You brought some fucking bagel beer. All right,
Are we recording?
Sorry.
Oh yes, very much so.
Sorry.
Oh, okay, good.
I just had to like. I just was giving it. That,
I told you.
Right, just
control
right,
chaos.
Josh rant.
There's
Okay,
only
so-
a massive stack of pizzas over there.
And 1, 2, ready. Okay, so my podcast, my podcast that I regularly appear on is wheredotheroadgo.com with Soraya Azkath and a bunch of people that I am, I try to hang with. It's been quite humbling to hang out with, Randall, who is like, I feel like I'm the stupidest kid in the room or the world's tallest midget, one or the other.
No, you're not.
And if you want to know any more about me, I'm joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN, like a cut on your chin.com, an ill-maintained blog, but I try to keep everything updated in terms of my interviews. So if you want to really like mainline and punish yourself with like 36 hours of me talking, you can find that there, as well as updates about all my future projects.
Dr. Future?
If you want to hear old stuff, still oldies but goodies, there's 7 years of archive shows, 300 shows at futurequake.com. Future and Quake, like earthquake.com. They're all archived there, MP3s. There's something there to offend everybody. If you want to just see some occasional writings I do to show people that I'm still alive while I'm finishing my book series, you can go to twospiesreport.wordpress.com. That's TWOSPIES report.com or .wordpress.com. And my email address, drfuture@futurequake.com, is right on the front of the FutureQuake website. And love to hear from you. It's been great again to be on the 2000th show here again.
2000s, yes.
I will add
actually
that,
get there someday.
Let me add that the Sacred Geometry International website is about to be upgraded and relaunched. Cameron Wiltshire has been working on it for months now, and I just had a glimpse of it a couple of days ago, and I think it's going to be a really great improvement. And because there's gotten to be so much material up there, it's gotten hard to navigate. So he's reorganized it all, and we've also got the first installment of an online sacred geometry course where I basically take people through the rudiments of geometric drawing and then take them into the depths of the sacred geometry system and how it works and how it applies to all kinds of things from architecture to art to geology to astronomy to the measurement of space and the measurement of time. And that's the advanced stuff that we're working on. But what I've got up there now is like 14 lessons, I think, which is an introduction to the whole system. And I don't know of anything else that's like it. And anybody who subscribes to that, they get a custom made compass for drawing that I designed myself because I couldn't find something suitable for the exercises we use. But it's basically very much like you would have learned in the Platonic Academy or a Pythagorean lodge, in that it's the hands-on, you use the compass and the square, and you begin with the simplest geometric elements, and then it gets progressively more evolved. And then as we explore these, things like the root ratios and the golden section and the geometry of the Great Pyramid and all of this, then we go into all of the elaborate applications of this information, both in the world of the human created world and in the natural world. So that's going up. So check it out. You might...
Randall, you got hours and hours of material already on those websites.
Yeah, I do. I have a lot of material, and there's going to be a lot more material going up soon. Right. So, and I've got upcoming, so I'll also put out there that, I regularly, now that I've gotten through the recession that financially held me back for a couple of years, I'm trying to get back to doing maybe 3 expeditions a year to do continued research. And I'm on the trail of some really hot stuff right now. And I could hopefully be collaborating with some of the gentlemen from the Comet Research Group. as an outgrowth of this roundtable thing that I did with them earlier in the fall.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you for having us, Adam.
This is really great. Very enlightening. I think we covered just about every subject in the book.
Yeah, I need a massage and like a salt bath.
Yeah, just drink some more of your Hellfire water.
My
You'll be good.
water.
All right, we'll close this section out, and we're going to be back with a extra special reunion on Conspiranormal.
No cussing?
All right. It's already gotten started.
You started it?
We're doing like about a 10-minute segment here, guys, after the 3.5 hour segment we just did.
We drank the whole time.
You guys did drink the whole time.
Yeah, we've been inside.
But we got Jeff.
Hey, babe.
Renee.
Hey.
And, of course, Rob.
Still here.
The Leisure Hour reunion.
Roberino.
This is the part they will not be listening to.
This is the comic relief section.
They hate us. They hate us.
So we missed the Leisure Hour. Is there any possibility that it's going to come back?
No.
I don't think that anyone misses the Leisure Hour at all.
I haven't seen Jeff or Rob since. And
Renee is being
I would
a
like to not
real
repeat
B
this.
word about the whole thing. And it is upsetting. It wasn't me, it was them. I placed the blame on them.
This feels like one of those behind the musics where one of us needs to storm out and then...
Yeah, it's Rob's constant drug use.
So you don't understand what Jeff was like backstage. You guys have no idea. He comes out and he's
I'm
all
sorry.
cheerful, but back, oh my God. Before the show, nightmare.
It's constant drug use, and it's all rectal. You take everything from rectum drug-wise. Never mind. Forget it. That was a bad joke.
Doesn't take like anything by the ear or anything like that.
And it's pretty common, actually. It's not
drug use.
It's not that weird, all right?
Is suppositorial a word?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
sure.
Okay.
Suppositorial.
Yeah.
Forget it. I'm aborting
So
that.
is
joke.
that the same as professional, as professorial?
Yeah, man, it's been a long time since I've casted pod.
I think this explains Jeff. So earlier tonight, he was like, "Does someone have a LaCroix?" That's the end. No, but no. He goes, "Does someone have a LaCroix?" And I was like, "Oh, Jeff, yeah, I got some in my trunk. Do you want some?" He goes, "What flavor?"
No,
and I said,
"No, I did not." Nay, I did not say that. What I said was, "Do you have any LaCroix?" And you go, "Yeah, I think I got cranberry." And I was like, "Do you have a UTI? What the hell is that?" Gross. Nobody drinks that.
That's not how I sound. Basically, I said, I have a free LaCroix for you that I will go into my car and get out of my trunk.
This is how she
he was
sounds.
like, F you. That's
This is how she sounds.
This is the adults only section,
Sorry.
guys.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
It's perfectly fine.
Sorry, yeah, that
we
was
might just
ruining
keep them. We should just keep them all in.
Did you ask Jeff about the horses?
What?
Yeah, what's your damage with horses, Jeff?
Oh my God, I hate horses. What about them? I'm not a big fan of horses.
Well, the topic of horses came up earlier tonight, and I asked Renee if she knew that you didn't care for them so much.
I don't. I have a fear of horses. I will let them coexist with me on this planet, but
Because
I do not like horses.
I'm not going to lie. That conversation the other night about horses was one of my favorites I've had in weeks.
Well,
I believe your exact words were, "They're like giant mean dogs. I hate them. I hate their stupid tails, and I hate the way they poop."
I do not like how they poop. I disagree with that. And I also I've seen somebody get like, "Oh yeah, this is the sweetest horse ever," and then it head butted him, with that big snout thing. And I don't like horses. And then I was chatting with my girlfriend, and yes, there is a human woman that will deal with me. And I was like, babe, do you like horses? And she says, no, not especially. And I said, you are my soulmate. I love you so much. Hey, do you guys have any cigars?
Yeah, we do.
We do.
Oh my God.
We had some cigars.
I did promise Jeff cigars to get him here.
No, it wasn't. You make me sound like an asshole.
You are an asshole.
Well, touche.
I just wanted the opportunity to get for our 200th episode to get you guys, all three of you guys, back together on a podcast.
Well,
it doesn't matter how long or short it was going to be.
You know that we love you.
Absolutely.
And you were always
you
a big support of us, and your friendship will always be cherished.
Oh man, bro moment.
And I love you.
Oh,
I love Roberino.
Just love you too, Jeff.
But I like what you do. It's really
Let's
nice.
do some karaoke.
I'm down. Also, too, to say that Renee is going to be helping. Renee is going to be helping us out on the show in the capacity of getting people booked. So she's going to start doing that for us.
Mistake.
I'm very flattered.
She ran our show right into the ground.
That's why it never took off.
Yeah, it's because of Renee.
All me.
All right, guys, let's hit some karaoke. We'll be back. We'll be back later on, guys, to close out the 200th episode on Paranormal.
Oh, Josh.
And it's a few days later.
It is. The studio is still demolished. We had a hell of a party.
Yeah, we did. And there's still like pizza crusts on a plate over there.
There's like a half a cookie that Randall was eating over there. There's pizza crust over there. There's bottles. I got a shit ton of Hellwater whiskey.
That's still here.
I'm still drinking it.
Well, somebody's got to drink
restore homeostasis now.
That's right.
Homeostasis.
Well, how did you guys feel about the 200th episode?
That was awesome. Such a random collection, but like a great collection at the same time. Those three guys together. You know, we had Joshua, Randall, and Dr. Future, who, you know, all experts on various topics that we cover here, but nothing that we've ever like converged. And I think it was great.
It also was very cool that we had somewhat of a studio audience.
Yeah,
but like 3 or 4 people.
Yeah, well, and others coming in and out and mingling and listening and.
Yeah, I took plenty of pictures for the YouTube video. I'll have the pictures as a slideshow.
Some of our favorite local fans and supporters were here. And
Surfiel, otherwise known as Will, he asked a lot of good questions.
He did.
So, in that point of doing that whole thing with those three guys, which was a freaking powerhouse. So it was just me pretty much being a moderator the entire time of that. And then we also got to speak to, as you just heard, Jeff and Renee as well. A little brief leisure hour reunion between you three.
Nappy Roots.
Which is funny because they showed up and they hung out with Alyssa and they got like good and hammered before they came out and even saw us.
Yeah. You hang out with Alyssa, that's what's going to happen.
That's right.
That's just what's going to happen. Luke.
Yo.
So how'd you feel about the 200th episode?
I just came to drink and play with dogs.
That's true. And then afterwards, you and Josh were like bonding over there.
Yeah, he couldn't keep his hands off me. I think he thought I was a chick or something. No, I'm kidding. He was awesome.
I mean, yeah,
man.
he was like running around naked down the street too. Like I don't know what was going on with that.
Back. I mean, I don't think all the neighbors saw him. It was cool.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
He's a cool dude. I like him.
Yeah. It was definitely fun to hang out with those guys in a non-professional, so to speak, setting, you know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was pretty happy about it. Well, just to say this, thank you guys for being here and getting us to episode 200.
Thank you guys for starting this shit and getting me involved.
Yeah.
Damn.
Thank you for doing it.
You're welcome.
I mean, you know, you're a big part of what makes this happen. And Luke, you know, he's Luke.
Yeah.
So
I just fill in space over here. Like.
Right. Well, you are the comedy relief, sir. That's for sure.
You provide the energy, man. You don't understand how much we feed off of that.
Yep. So here's to the next 100, and we're going to get to 300, and then who knows from there.
Right.
So thank you so much, guys, for listening to this mega opus 200th episode of Conspiranormal.